Chapter 1. La Révélation. The Revelation. Fleur Delacour awakened to the taste of copper and the sound of raised voices echoing through stone corridors. The hospital wing's familiar antiseptic scent couldn't quite mask something else, something that made her Vila heritage prickle with unease. Dark magic. Recent. Violent. She tried to sit up, wincing as her ribs protested. The last thing she remembered was entering the maze for the third task, her wand ready, her heart pounding with the thrill of competition. Then nothing. A stunning spell, perhaps. How long had she been unconscious? Absolutely refused to believe such nonsense. The voice belonged to Cornelius Fudge, though it carried none of its usual pompous authority. Instead, it cracked with something that might have been fear. The boy is clearly traumatized, Dumbledore, or Cedric Diggory's death was tragic. But these wild claims about you-know-who, Harry Potter does not lie about such matters, Minister. Dumbledore's voice was steady, but Fleur caught an undertone she'd never heard before. Weariness, perhaps, or something darker. Fleur's breath caught. Cedric was dead. The boy disappeared from the maze for over an hour. Fudge's voice grew shrill. An hour, Dumbledore. And he returns with Diggory's body and claims he witnessed some sort of resurrection ritual. It's preposterous. The stress of the tournament has clearly... Minister. Madame Pomfrey's voice cut through the argument like a blade. You are disturbing my patience. If you must continue this discussion, please do so elsewhere. Footsteps approached Fleur's bed, and she quickly closed her eyes, feigning unconsciousness. Through her lashes, she watched the school matron check her pulse with practiced efficiency. "How is she?" Dumbledore asked quietly. "Stunned," Pomfrey replied curtly. "Quite thoroughly, I might add. Whoever cast that spell intended to keep her unconscious for some time. She's lucky young Potter and Diggory reached the cup when they did, or she might have been trapped in that maze all night." Potter and Diggory. Together. But only Harry had returned. Fleur's chest tightened with a grief she hadn't expected. She barely knew Cedric Diggory, had spoken to him perhaps 3 times throughout the tournament. But he'd been kind to her after the second task, when she'd failed so spectacularly with the Grindylows. He'd offered her a smile and a quiet, better luck in the next one, that had meant more than he could have known. And now he was dead. "The girl should rest," Pomfrey continued, "as should Mr. Potter, though I suspect he won't be allowed such luxury." The disapproval in her voice was unmistakable. "Harry needs to be debriefed while the events are still fresh in his memory," Fudge said defensively. "These claims he's making are serious accusations that could cause widespread panic." "These claims he's making," Dumbledore interrupted softly, "are the truth." The silence that followed was deafening. When the men finally left, their argument fading down the corridor, Fleur opened her eyes fully. The hospital wing was dimly lit, the late evening light filtering through tall windows. How long had she been unconscious? The third task had begun at dusk. "Awake, are you?" Pomfrey appeared at her bedside, a cup of steaming liquid in her hands. "I'll drink this. It will help with the headache." Fleur accepted the cup gratefully, the warm liquid soothing her parched throat. "Cedric Diggory," she said quietly. "He is truly..." Pomfrey's expression softened with grief. "I'm afraid so, dear. I'm very sorry. What happened in the maze? I remember entering, but then..." Fleur frowned, trying to piece together fragmented memories. "There was someone else there. Not a creature. A person." "You were stunned by Bartemius Crouch Jr.," Pomfrey said, her voice tight with anger. "He'd been impersonating Professor Moody all year. The entire tournament was... It was a trap, Miss Delacour, designed to deliver Mr. Potter to you-know-who." The cup trembled in Fleur's hands. A trap. The tournament she'd been so proud to compete in, so eager to prove herself worthy of, had been nothing more than an elaborate snare. And she'd been collateral damage, stunned and left helpless while Harry and Cedric walked unknowingly toward their doom. "Where is Harry now?" she asked. Pomfrey hesitated. "In the bed at the far end. He's been given a sleeping draught, but—" She shook her head. "The poor boy keeps waking up. Nightmares, I suspect." Fleur set down her cup and slowly pushed back her covers. Her legs felt unsteady, but she managed to stand. "I would like to see him. Miss Delacour, you should rest. Please." Fleur met the older woman's eyes. "I need to see him." Something in her expression must have convinced Pomfrey, because the matron nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes. No more. Fleur made her way across the hospital wing on unsteady legs, passing empty beds until she reached the far corner, where heavy curtains had been drawn around a single bed. She hesitated at the gap in the fabric, unsure what she expected to find. Harry Potter lay curled on his side, facing away from her. Even in sleep, tension radiated from his small frame. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and as Fleur watched, he murmured something unintelligible and flinched as if dodging a blow. She stepped closer, and her Vila heritage responded immediately to what it sensed. The air around Harry Potter thrummed with barely contained trauma, layer upon layer of it built up over years. But underneath that, threading through it like poison through water, was something else. Something deliberate and calculating and cold. Dark magic, old dark magic, wound around him like chains. Fleur's breath caught. She'd felt something similar once before, in her grandmother's stories about the wizards who'd tried to bind and control Vila during the old wars. Magic designed not to kill, but to constrain and manipulate. "Miss Delacour?" She turned to find Dumbledore standing at the foot of Harry's bed, his blue eyes twinkling with their usual benevolent warmth. But now, with her heightened senses still reeling from what she'd detected around Harry, that warmth seemed false, calculated. "Headmaster," she said carefully. "I wanted to check on Harry. After what happened in the maze—" "Quite understandable," Dumbledore said kindly. "Harry has been through a terrible ordeal, but he is strong, and he will recover." "Will he?" The question slipped out before Fleur could stop it, sharpened by the lingering taste of dark magic in the air. "And forgive me, Headmaster, but this tournament, it was designed to harm him, was it not?" Dumbledore's smile never wavered. "The tournament was corrupted by forces beyond our control, my dear. Voldemort used Barty Crouch Jr. to manipulate events, yes, but Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire." Fleur's voice was steady, but her hands had begun to tremble with more than after-effects from the stunning spell. A 14-year-old boy entered into a tournament designed for legal adults. Did you not think to question how this was possible? The goblet's magic is binding. The goblet's magic can be fooled, as we have seen. Fleur stepped closer to Harry's bed, and the dark magic around him seemed to pulse in response to her presence. But even if it could not be, there were other options. You could have withdrawn Hogwarts from the tournament. You could have demanded the other schools compete without their own champions in solidarity. You could have done any number of things to protect a child who should never have been placed in such danger. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened, and for just a moment the grandfatherly mask slipped. "You do not understand the full situation, Miss Delacour. Then explain it to me." The words came out more forcefully than Fleur had intended, and she saw Dumbledore's eyebrows rise in surprise. "Explain to me how allowing a child to face dragons and dark creatures and armed opponents serves any purpose other than cruelty. Harry Potter is not an ordinary child. He is 14 years old." Fleur's voice cracked with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. 14! And you speak of him as if he were a weapon to be wielded, rather than a boy to be protected. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the patient tone one might use with a particularly slow student. "Harry's circumstances are unique, Miss Delacour. There are prophecies involved, magical protections that require specific conditions to maintain. Sometimes, difficult choices must be made for the greater good. The greater good. Fleur had heard those words before, in her grandmother's stories about the wizards who justified enslaving Vila for their own purposes, always for the greater good, always for some higher cause that somehow required the suffering of those who couldn't fight back. "And who decides what constitutes this greater good?" she asked quietly. "Who gave you the right to make these choices for him?" Dumbledore's smile returned, but it was colder now. "I am afraid this conversation has become rather philosophical for such a late hour. Perhaps you should return to your own bed, my dear. The morning will bring much to consider." It was a dismissal, gentle but firm. Fleur recognized it for what it was, a refusal to engage with her questions, wrapped in patronizing concern for her well-being. She looked down at Harry, still trapped in whatever nightmare plagued his sleep, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. A decision, perhaps, or a promise. "You are right," she said finally. "The morning will bring much to consider." She returned to her own bed, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and let her mind work through what she'd learned. A tournament designed as a trap. A headmaster who spoke of 14-year-old boys as weapons. Dark magic wound around Harry Potter like chains, old and purposeful and deliberate. And underneath it all, a question that burned in her chest. If the adults charged with protecting Harry Potter had failed him so thoroughly, what obligation did that place on those who could act? The answer came to her as dawn light began to filter through the hospital wing windows. She rose quietly, found parchment and a quill from Pomfrey's desk, and began to write. "Maman, Papa, I write to you of une urgence internationale. A child has been endangered through the deliberate negligence of those meant to protect him. The British magical establishment has failed catastrophically in their duty of care. I fear that without intervention, this child will continue to suffer for causes he never chose, and burdens he should never have been forced to bear. I am invoking Article 12 of the International Confederation's Child Protection Accords. Please contact the Ministry immediately. This cannot stand. Your daughter, Fleur." She sealed the letter, called for a school owl, and watched it disappear into the morning sky. The greater good, indeed. But perhaps it was time someone asked, greater good for whom? Chapter 2. L'arrivée des Aurors, the arrival of the Aurors. Dawn had barely broken over Hogwarts when the first portkey arrived. Fleur felt it before she saw it, a sharp displacement of air that made her Vila heritage prickle with awareness. Or she'd been sitting by the hospital wing window since before sunrise, unable to sleep, watching the grounds slowly emerge from the pre-dawn darkness. Harry had finally stopped his restless murmuring an hour ago, falling into what might charitably be called proper rest, though even in sleep his small hands remained clenched into fists. The second portkey followed minutes later, its arrival announced by the distant sound of voices speaking rapid French, authoritative voices, angry voices. Fleur's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had come. "Miss Delacour?" Madame Pomfrey appeared at her elbow, looking haggard in the early morning light. "There are visitors requesting to see you, French ministry officials." Through the window, Fleur could see figures moving across the grounds toward the castle's main entrance. Even from this distance, she recognized her mother's elegant stride and her father's protective posture as he walked beside her. But there were others too, people in the deep blue robes of French Aurors, moving with the controlled urgency of law enforcement, responding to a crisis. "I will go to them," Fleur said, rising from her chair beside the window. "Perhaps you should wait," Pomfrey began, but Fleur was already moving toward the hospital wing doors. She made her way through the castle corridors, her bare feet silent on the stone floors. The early morning quiet felt ominous, as if the very walls were holding their breath. From the entrance hall below, she could hear the sound of the great doors opening, and Dumbledore's voice, carefully modulated to project calm authority. "Welcome to Hogwarts. I must say, this is rather unexpected. Headmaster Dumbledore." The voice that interrupted belonged to a woman Fleur didn't recognize, crisp and professional in the way that meant serious business. "I am Auror Captain Amélie Rousseau, of the French Ministry's Department of International Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. We are here regarding the incident involving Miss Fleur Delacour and the endangered minor, Harry Potter." Fleur paused at the top of the marble staircase, hidden in the shadows, but able to see the scene unfolding in the entrance hall below. Her parents stood flanked by 3 Aurors in official robes, while a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, clearly the ministry official, held a leather portfolio that presumably contained official documentation. As Dumbledore stood before them in his purple nightrobes, somehow managing to project dignity, despite the early hour and informal dress. But Fleur could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained carefully visible and still. He was being very careful not to appear threatening to a group of foreign Aurors on his own territory. "I'm afraid there has been some misunderstanding," Dumbledore said gently. "While the tournament's conclusion was indeed tragic, I can assure you that all participants received appropriate care." "All participants?" Captain Rousseau's voice sharpened. "Headmaster, according to the report we received, Miss Delacour was stunned and left unconscious in a maze filled with dangerous creatures, while a 14-year-old British student was transported against his will to an undisclosed location where he witnessed both murder and the resurrection of a known terrorist." The word terrorist hung in the air like a physical thing. Fleur had never heard Voldemort described that way, but she supposed it was accurate from an international perspective. The French ministry would view him as exactly that, a dangerous criminal whose activities threatened international magical security. "The circumstances were indeed unfortunate," Dumbledore acknowledged, "but I'm not certain what you hope to accomplish." "We hope to accomplish our legal obligation under international magical law." The thin man with spectacles stepped forward, opening his portfolio with practiced efficiency. "Marcel Dubois, French Ministry Department of International Magical Cooperation. Article 15 of the International Confederation of Wizards Child Protection Accords grants any member nation the right to intervene when a minor citizen has been endangered through cross-border magical incident." Professor McGonagall appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her tartan dressing gown wrapped tightly around her thin frame and her hair in disarray. She looked between Dumbledore and the French delegation with an expression of growing alarm. "Albus," she said quietly, "what is happening?" "The French ministry has some concerns about recent events," Dumbledore replied, his tone suggesting these concerns were both unreasonable and easily dismissed. McGonagall's sharp eyes moved from Dumbledore to the French officials, and Fleur saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, of the gravity of the situation. "Headmaster Dumbledore," Captain Rousseau continued, her voice carrying the weight of official authority, "we require immediate access to both Miss Delacour and Mr. Potter for interviews regarding the circumstances that led to their endangerment." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Dumbledore said smoothly. "Both students are recovering from their ordeal and require rest, not interrogation." "This is not an interrogation," Dubois interjected, his accent crisp with indignation. "This is a welfare assessment mandated by international law." The sound of footsteps echoed from one of the side corridors, and Fleur tensed as she recognized the approaching figure. Professor Snape emerged from the dungeons, his black robes billowing behind him, and his expression thunderous even by his usual standards. "How touching," Snape drawled, his voice carrying easily across the entrance hall. "The French have arrived to play hero for Potter. One wonders what they hope to gain from this theatrical display." Fleur's mother stepped forward, and for the first time since arriving, spoke. Her voice carried the melodious quality that marked her Velar heritage, but underneath it was steel. Professor Snape, is it not? We hope to gain the assurance that a child who has been systematically endangered will receive proper protection. Perhaps this concept is foreign to you. Snape's eyes narrowed dangerously. I would be very careful about making accusations you cannot substantiate. Madame Delacour, Fleur's mother replied coolly, and I make no accusations. I simply observe that a 14-year-old boy has been forced to face dragons, dark creatures, and armed opponents in what was supposedly an educational tournament, then was transported by dark magic to witness murder. The pattern speaks for itself. The pattern, Snape said with venomous precision, is that Potter has an unfortunate tendency to find trouble wherever he goes. The fact that he survived last night is testament to his luck, not evidence of systematic endangerment. Severus. McGonagall's voice cracked like a whip. That is quite enough. But the damage was done. Captain Rousseau's expression had shifted from professional concern to something far more dangerous. Professor Snape, she said quietly, did you just suggest that a child is responsible for the repeated attempts on his life? The silence that followed was deafening. Even Snape seemed to realize he had overplayed his hand, but his pride prevented him from backing down. I suggested, he said coldly, that Potter's heroic tendencies often place him in situations that more cautious individuals would avoid. Heroic tendencies. Dubois repeated the words as if tasting something particularly unpleasant. You speak of a child's attempts to protect others as a character flaw rather than evidence of poor adult supervision. From her vantage point at the top of the stairs, Fleur watched McGonagall's face cycle through a series of emotions, alarm, recognition, and finally something that might have been horror, as the full implications of Snape's words sank in. Professor Snape, McGonagall said carefully, perhaps you should return to your quarters. I think not. Snape's attention fixed on the French delegation with obvious hostility. I think these people need to understand that their interference is neither wanted nor necessary. Potter is a British citizen at a British school, and whatever delusions of rescue they may harbour— Professor Snape, Captain Rousseau's voice could have cut glass. Are you attempting to intimidate French ministry officials in the course of their legal duties? The question hung in the air, and Fleur saw Dumbledore close his eyes briefly, as if pained by his colleague's spectacular failure of diplomacy. I think, Dumbledore said quickly, we are all rather tired after the events of last night. Perhaps this conversation might be more productive after breakfast. This conversation will be productive now, Rousseau replied firmly, or it will be productive in front of the International Confederation of Wizards. Your choice, Headmaster. It was, Fleur realized, beautifully done. Presented not as a threat, but as a reasonable accommodation. Cooperate now in the relative privacy of Hogwarts, or have the matter escalated to the highest levels of international magical law. McGonagall seemed to understand the implications as well. Albus, she said quietly, perhaps we should hear what the French ministry requires. Dumbledore's smile never wavered, but Fleur caught the flash of annoyance in his eyes before it was suppressed. Of course, Minerva. We are always happy to cooperate with our international colleagues. Excellent. Captain Rousseau opened her own portfolio and withdrew a set of official documents. We require immediate interviews with Miss Delacour and Mr. Potter, access to all medical records related to their treatment, and a complete accounting of the security measures that were in place during the tournament. Furthermore, Dubois added, consulting his own notes, we require interviews with all faculty members who had supervisory responsibility for student welfare during the tournament, as well as any documentation related to the selection process that resulted in Mr. Potter's participation. The scope of the investigation was breathtaking. Fleur hadn't expected them to be so thorough, but she supposed her letter had conveyed the urgency she'd felt. Her parents had clearly taken her concerns seriously. This is quite extensive, Dumbledore observed mildly. Child endangerment investigations typically are, Rousseau replied, without a trace of apology. A new voice interrupted from the direction of the great hall. What is the meaning of this disturbance? Fleur's stomach sank as she recognized Victor Crumb's accent, though his voice sounded strained and uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. The Durmstrang champion appeared in the doorway, still in his night clothes, but alert despite the early hour. "Mr. Crum," Captain Rousseau said, her professional manner softening slightly. "We are French ministry officials investigating the incident that occurred during last night's tournament task. As a participant, your testimony would be valuable." Victor's eyes were wide and slightly unfocused, and Fleur could see him struggling to organize his thoughts. The aftermath effects of the Imperious Curse, she realized with a chill. She had heard it could leave victims disoriented and confused for days afterward. "The maze," Victor said slowly. "I was not myself. Someone else was controlling." He pressed his hands to his temples, clearly in distress. "I attacked Cedric. I would never, but I could not stop myself." The admission sent a shock through the assembled group. Even Snape's hostility faltered in the face of Victor's obvious anguish. "Mr. Crum," Dubois said gently, "are you saying you were placed under the Imperious Curse during the tournament?" "Yes." Victor's voice was barely above a whisper. "By the man who was pretending to be Professor Moody. He used me to hurt Cedric so that Harry would have a clear path to the cup." His eyes found Dumbledore's across the hall. This was all planned, yes? The whole tournament was a trap for Harry Potter. The words fell into the silence, like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread through the gathered adults. Even Dumbledore's carefully maintained composure showed cracks. "Victor," he said carefully, "you've been through a terrible trauma. Perhaps you should rest before making such statements." But Captain Rousseau was already moving, her aura training evident in the way she approached Victor with professional compassion. "Mr. Crum, would you be willing to give us a formal statement about your experiences?" Victor nodded eagerly, as if grateful to finally have someone who would listen to him. "Yes. Yes, I will tell you everything. What was done to me, what I was forced to do. It was not right. None of this was right." Fleur felt a surge of gratitude toward the Bulgarian champion. His testimony would carry significant weight, an international student with no particular loyalty to either Harry or the British magical establishment, speaking publicly about the tournament's corruption. From her hiding place at the top of the stairs, she watched the French delegation exchange meaningful glances. They had come prepared for resistance, but they were finding allies in unexpected places. And in that moment, Fleur knew that her desperate letter home had set something in motion that could not be stopped. The adults who had failed Harry Potter were about to discover that their failure had consequences. The greater good, indeed. But this time, perhaps, it would be defined by those who actually sought to protect the innocent rather than exploit them. The revolution, she thought with dark satisfaction, had begun. Chapter 3. Les questions dangereuses, dangerous questions. The hospital wing had been transformed into something resembling a formal interview room, though Madame Pomfrey's pointed glances at the assembled officials made clear her feelings about the arrangement. Captain Rousseau sat across from Harry's bed, her quill poised above official parchment, while Marcel Dubois arranged his own documents with methodical precision. Fleur positioned herself at Harry's bedside, close enough to offer silent support while serving as emotional translator for nuances the French officials might miss. Harry looked impossibly young against the white hospital linens, his dark hair still bearing traces of the previous night's ordeal, and his eyes holding a wariness that no 14-year-old should possess. He'd agreed to the interview with the resigned acceptance that Fleur was beginning to recognize as his default response to adult demands. "Mr. Potter," Captain Rousseau began gently, her English carefully modulated to put him at ease. "We understand that last night was traumatic for you. We want to help ensure that nothing like this happens again." Harry's laugh held no humour. "That's what they always say." Fleur felt her heart clench at the bitter exhaustion in his voice. Beside her, she caught her mother's sharp intake of breath as Apolline's velar senses responded to the waves of resigned despair radiating from the boy. "They?" Dubois asked carefully, his quill hovering over parchment. "Adults," Harry said simply. "After every incident, someone always says they'll make sure it doesn't happen again." "Tell us about these incidents," Rousseau requested. "Start wherever feels comfortable." Harry was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands where they rested on the bed covers. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but flat, as if recounting someone else's story. First year. Professor Quirrell was possessed by Voldemort and tried to steal the Philosopher's Stone. He would have succeeded if I hadn't, as if me and Ron and Hermione hadn't stopped him. "You stopped him?" Dubois' voice carried carefully controlled alarm. "Mr. Potter, you were 11 years old." "Yes." Harry's tone suggested this was obvious. "The stone was hidden in the castle, protected by obstacles that the teachers had created. When we realized someone was going to steal it, we went through the protections ourselves. Devil's snare that nearly strangled Hermione, a riddle that could have killed us if she'd gotten it wrong, a giant chess game that broke Ron's ribs." He paused, looking up at their shocked faces with something like surprise. "We told McGonagall that someone was after the stone, but she said the protections were sufficient. They weren't." Fleur watched Captain Rousseau's expression shift from professional concern to something approaching horror. "Mr. Potter, are you telling us that you, as an 11-year-old student, were forced to navigate deadly magical protections because the adult authorities failed to take your warnings seriously?" "I wasn't forced," Harry corrected, with the precision of someone who'd had this argument before. "I chose to go. Professor Dumbledore said afterward that it was important that I learn to make my own choices about fighting evil." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Madame Pomfrey, who'd been pointedly organizing medical supplies to show her disapproval of the interview, had gone very still. "Professor Dumbledore said this to an 11-year-old child?" Apolline's voice carried the musical quality of her velar heritage, but underneath it was something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "He said a lot of things," Harry replied with a shrug that Fleur recognized as forced casualness, "about choices and courage and how some things are worth dying for." Marcel Dubois set down his quill with the careful control of someone fighting not to throw it. "Mr. Potter, what happened in your second year?" "The Chamber of Secrets was opened. Students were being petrified by a basilisk, a 1,000-year-old serpent that kills with its gaze and petrifies through indirect contact. Hermione figured out what it was, but she was petrified before she could tell anyone. Then Ginny Weasley was taken into the chamber." Harry's voice grew quieter. "The teachers were going to close the school, send everyone home, but Ginny would have died. So you went into the chamber," Rousseau said, "and it wasn't a question. Ron came with me. We tried to take Professor Lockhart too, but he tried to obliviate us and the tunnel collapsed." Harry's matter-of-fact recounting of near-death experiences was becoming more disturbing with each revelation. "I went on alone, found Ginny, and fought the basilisk. It nearly killed me. Would have if Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix, hadn't helped." "You fought a 1,000-year-old basilisk," Dubois repeated slowly, "at the age of 12. Tom Riddle was there too. From a diary, he was draining Ginny's life force to return to life himself." Harry looked up at their shocked faces again, and Fleur caught a flash of something that might have been confusion. "Why do you all look like that? Adults knew there was a monster in the school. They knew students were in danger. They just, or couldn't find it." Captain Rousseau exchanged a look with Dubois that spoke volumes. "Mr. Potter, were you given any additional protection or support after this incident?" "Professor Dumbledore told me I'd done well." that it showed the strength of my character. Harry's voice held that same flat quality that suggested these were words he'd heard many times but never quite believed. Third year was the Dementors. Mon Dieu, Apolline breathed, and Fleur saw her mother's hands clench in her lap. They were supposed to be guarding the school because Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban, Harry continued, but they affected me more than other people. Made me hear my parents dying. Made me relive it. Did anyone provide you with additional support for this trauma response? Rousseau asked, her professional composure beginning to crack. Professor Lupin taught me the Patronus charm, how to fight them off. For the first time, Harry's voice carried a note of genuine warmth. He actually helped. The implication hung heavy in the air, that Professor Lupin was noteworthy for actually helping, rather than this being the expected response from adults charged with Harry's care. And this year, Dubois prompted gently. Harry's expression shuttered. The tournament. My name came out of the Goblet of Fire, even though I didn't enter, and I'm underage. Everyone thought I'd cheated somehow. Even Ron didn't believe me at first. His voice grew smaller. I faced a dragon in the first task. Nearly got burned alive. The second task, they took people we'd sorely miss and put them at the bottom of the lake. Made us think they'd die if we didn't save them in time. They took people? Captain Rousseau's voice was deadly quiet. Hermione. Ron's sister Ginny. A little girl from Beauxbatons. Harry glanced at Fleur apologetically. Your sister, I think. I'm sorry. I couldn't leave her down there, even after I'd gotten Ron. You saved Gabriel. Apollina's voice cracked with emotion, and she reached out to touch Harry's hand. Through their connection, Fleur felt her mother's vila. Senses responding to something in Harry. Not deception, but a bone-deep honesty that carried its own pain. Mon pauvre enfant, you saved ma petite fille. She was just so small, Harry said quietly. I couldn't leave her. Fleur watched her mother's face cycle through a series of emotions as her vila heritage confirmed what they were all beginning to understand, that Harry Potter was telling them the absolute truth, without embellishment or self-pity, about a pattern of systematic endangerment that spanned his entire magical education. Mr. Potter, Dubois said carefully, in any of these incidents, were you provided with professional counseling or trauma support? Harry looked genuinely puzzled. What do you mean? Someone to talk to about your experiences. Someone trained to help children process traumatic events. Oh, Harry considered this. No. Professor Dumbledore usually wanted to talk afterward, but it was more about lessons learned, character building. He paused, or Madame Pomfrey always fixed the injuries. Captain Rousseau's expression had gone very still. Mr. Potter, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Do you believe the adults in your life have adequately protected you from harm? The question seemed to surprise Harry. He was quiet for a long time, and Fleur could see him wrestling with concepts that perhaps he'd never been allowed to articulate before. They tell me I'm safe, he said finally, that the protection is there even when I can't see it, that the dangers I face are necessary for my development, for the greater good. The greater good, Apolline repeated, and there was something dangerous in her tone. Professor Dumbledore says that sometimes people have to make sacrifices for the greater good, or that some of us are born with responsibilities. Harry's voice grew quieter. That I can't have a normal life because of who I am and what I have to do. The room fell silent except for the scratch of Marcel Dubois' quill as he documented Harry's words. When he looked up, his expression was grim. Captain, he said quietly, I believe we need to expand our investigation. Agreed. Rousseau's professional mask had slipped entirely, revealing barely contained fury beneath. "Mr. Potter, we're going to need to speak with some of your classmates, people who witnessed these events. Would you be comfortable with that?" Harry nodded, though he looked uncertain. "Ron and Hermione, you mean?" "Among others." Captain Rousseau rose from her chair, and Fleur could see the controlled anger in her movements. "Mr. Potter, I want you to understand something very clearly. What you've described, these repeated incidents where you, as a minor, were placed in mortal danger with inadequate adult protection, this is not normal. It is not acceptable. And it is not something any child should have to endure for any cause, greater good or otherwise." Harry stared at her with something like wonder, as if the concept that his experiences might not be acceptable was entirely foreign to him. "We will be back to speak with you again," Rousseau continued. "In the meantime, I want you to rest and know that people are working to ensure your safety. Real safety, not the theoretical kind that requires you to face dragons." As the French officials filed out of the hospital wing, Fleur remained behind with her mother. Apolline was staring at Harry with an expression of fierce protectiveness that Fleur recognized from her childhood, the look her mother got when someone threatened her family. "Harry," Apolline said softly, "may I ask you something?" He nodded. "When was the last time an adult told you that you deserve to be protected simply because you are a child? Not because of your destiny or your responsibilities, but because children should be kept safe." Harry thought about this for a long time. So long, in fact, that Fleur began to suspect he couldn't remember such an instance. "I don't think anyone's ever said that," he admitted finally. Apolline's eyes blazed with maternal fury. "Then they have failed you more completely than I thought possible." In the corridor outside, they could hear Captain Rousseau's voice, sharp with professional outrage as she addressed someone, likely Dumbledore. "Headmaster, we need to speak with Miss Granger and Mr. Weasley immediately, and I want a complete list of every student who witnessed these incidents, every single one." Fleur smiled grimly. The dangerous questions had begun, and she suspected the answers would be more damning than even she had anticipated. The revolution was gathering momentum, one horrifying revelation at a time. Chapter 4. La Résistance de Dumbledore. Dumbledore's Resistance. The headmaster's office felt smaller than usual, with 4 people crowded around the circular room, the portraits of former headmasters maintaining an unusual silence, as if sensing the gravity of the conversation below. Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his expression one of patient concern, while McGonagall paced near the window with barely contained agitation. Snape stood rigid by the bookshelf, his dark eyes fixed on something in the middle distance, and Hagrid shifted uncomfortably in his too small chair, his beetle-black eyes darting between his colleagues with growing distress. "The French Ministry's investigation poses certain complications," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying its usual calm authority. "I thought it prudent to discuss our response as a unified front." "Our response?" McGonagall whirled to face him, her usually perfect composure showing stress fractures. "Albus, they're asking questions about Harry's welfare that I'm not certain we can answer satisfactorily. The questions themselves are not the problem, Minerva. The problem is the context in which they're being asked." Dumbledore's blue eyes met each of theirs in turn. "There are circumstances regarding Harry's situation that you do not fully understand. Circumstances that may require careful explanation." Snape's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a sneer. "How refreshingly honest of you, Headmaster. Are you finally going to tell us why Potter has been your pet project all these years?" "Severus," McGonagall warned, but Dumbledore raised a hand. "No, Minerva. Perhaps it is time." He stood, moving to the window where he could see the grounds below. Even from this distance, the French officials were visible, conducting interviews with students near the lake. "There is a prophecy, made 16 years ago, concerning Harry and Voldemort. The silence that followed was absolute. "Cut what kind of prophecy?" McGonagall asked quietly. "One that suggests Harry must face Voldemort in the end, that neither can live while the other survives." Dumbledore's voice carried the weight of years. "Everything I have done has been in service of preparing him for that confrontation." Hagrid's chair creaked as he shifted forward. "Professor, you don't mean... You can't be saying that Harry's got to die?" Snape finished, and there was something strange in his voice. "Is that what you're saying, Dumbledore? That Potter must die?" "The prophecy is ambiguous on that point," Dumbledore replied carefully. "But it does suggest that Harry's path will require great sacrifice. Every trial he has faced has been preparation for that ultimate test." McGonagall sank into a chair, her face pale. "Albus, what are you telling me, that you knew about the Philosopher's Stone? The Chamber of Secrets? That you deliberately—" "I did not arrange those dangers, Minerva. But when they arose, I saw opportunities for Harry to develop the courage and resourcefulness he will need." Dumbledore turned back to face them, and for the first time in years he looked every one of his 100+ years. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow those we care for to face adversity." "Allow?" Snape's voice was deadly quiet. "You placed him with his relatives, knowing full well what they would do to him." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. McGonagall's sharp intake of breath seemed unnaturally loud. "You knew," she whispered. "When I told you about the Dursleys, when I warned you what they were like, you knew they would mistreat him. The blood protection required nothing of the sort." McGonagall's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare hide behind magical theory, Albus. You placed that child with people you knew would harm him because you wanted him to suffer. You wanted him to be grateful for any scrap of kindness, easy to manipulate, desperate for approval." Dumbledore's mask of benevolent authority slipped for just a moment, revealing something colder beneath. "You do not understand the full complexity. I understand perfectly." Snape stepped away from the bookshelf, and his usual sneer had been replaced by something approaching disgust. "You needed a weapon, not a boy. A tool shaped by suffering, molded by desperation. Or you needed someone who would willingly walk to his death because he'd never been taught he deserved to live. Severus." "Do not," Snape said with quiet venom, "attempt to justify this to me. I have spent years serving you, believing in your vision of the greater good. But this—" He gestured toward the window where they could see Harry being escorted by French officials for what appeared to be a medical examination. "This is no different from what the Dark Lord does. You use people, Headmaster. You use them and discard them and tell yourself it's noble." Hagrid's massive hands were clenched in his lap. "Professor Dumbledore, you've got to tell me that Severus is wrong. He's just a boy." "You wouldn't really." "I have done what was necessary for the greater good," Dumbledore replied, and the familiar phrase carried none of its usual comfort. "Harry's sacrifice may be the only way to defeat Voldemort permanently. Maybe." McGonagall stood slowly, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Maybe you've shaped a child's entire life around a possibility. The prophecy could be interpreted a dozen different ways." McGonagall's voice rose. "But instead of exploring alternatives, instead of finding ways to protect Harry while still fulfilling whatever destiny awaits him, you chose the path that required him to suffer. Why, Albus?" The question echoed in the circular room, and for a long moment Dumbledore said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. "Because suffering builds character. Because hardship creates heroes. Because it was easier," Snape finished. "Or easier than actually teaching him to fight effectively. Easier than building his confidence and skills. Easier than treating him like a person rather than a symbol." Hagrid stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "I can't. I've got to." He looked between Dumbledore and the others, his face a picture of confusion and betrayal. "Harry trusts you, Professor. He looks up to you. And you've been preparing him for his destiny," Dumbledore said firmly. "You've been breaking him down so he'd be easy to sacrifice," McGonagall corrected, and her voice held a finality that made them all look at her sharply. "I will not be party to this, Albus. Not any more." A knock at the office door interrupted the charged silence. "Come," Dumbledore called, and Captain Rousseau entered with Marcel Dubois close behind her. "Headmaster," Rousseau said without preamble, "we need to discuss what we've learned from the faculty interviews." "Of course." Dumbledore's genial mask slid back into place with practiced ease. "I trust my colleagues have been cooperative?" "Illuminatingly so." Dubois consulted his notes with grim satisfaction. Professor Sprout, for instance, was quite forthcoming about her concerns regarding Mr. Potter's physical condition when he returns to school each September. McGonagall closed her eyes briefly. Pomona noticed too. She noticed malnutrition, signs of physical abuse, and emotional withdrawal, Rousseau continued. She also informed us that when she attempted to report these observations through proper channels, or she was told the situation was handled, and that further inquiry would be inappropriate. "Professor Sprout is a dedicated teacher," Dumbledore said carefully, "but she may have misinterpreted—" "Professor Flitwick told us the same story," Dubois interrupted, "as did Professor Sinistra and Professor Vector. Shall I continue?" The implications were staggering. Not one, but multiple faculty members had noticed Harry's distress and been discouraged from acting on it. "Furthermore," Rousseau continued, "we've spoken with Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, who remained at the castle due to their concern for Mr. Potter's welfare." Snape made a small sound of derision. "The Weasleys. Of course they would insert themselves." "Actually, Professor Snape, Mrs. Weasley provided some very interesting testimony." Captain Rousseau's smile was razor-sharp. She broke down completely when she realized how many times she'd wanted to take Mr. Potter home with her family, and how consistently those impulses were redirected. McGonagall looked up sharply. "Redirected?" "She said you visited their home several times, Headmaster, always shortly after she'd expressed concern about Harry's living situation. Always with gentle suggestions that perhaps it would be best if Harry remained with his relatives for the protection they provided." Dumbledore's hand stilled on his desk. "The blood protection. Mr. Weasley also confirmed that ministry files regarding Mr. Potter's welfare have been classified at your specific request on multiple occasions," Dubois added, "preventing routine welfare checks that might have identified his abuse years ago." The weight of systematic manipulation was becoming undeniable. Even Hagrid was staring at Dumbledore with something approaching horror. "Professor," Hagrid said quietly, "tell me they've got it wrong. Tell me you weren't. That you didn't." But Dumbledore's silence spoke volumes. "We have enough," Captain Rousseau said with professional satisfaction. "Headmaster Dumbledore, you are hereby notified that the French Ministry will be recommending a full investigation by the International Confederation of Wizards into your handling of Mr. Potter's welfare. We will also be requesting that he be placed in protective custody pending the resolution of these allegations." "You have no authority," Dumbledore began, but McGonagall cut him off. "Actually, at Albus I believe they do. As Deputy Headmistress, I am obligated to report suspected child endangerment to the appropriate authorities." She looked at Captain Rousseau with something like relief. "You have my full cooperation in this investigation." Snape moved toward the door. "And mine." "Mine, too," Hagrid said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Harry deserves better than this. He's always deserved better." Dumbledore watched his inner circle fragment around him, his blue eyes no longer twinkling with benevolent authority, but sharp with calculation. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. "Harry's protection depends on maintaining the current arrangements." without my guidance. Without your manipulation, McGonagall corrected. Harry might actually have a chance to live, instead of merely existing as your sacrificial lamb. As the French officials departed with their damning testimony, and his closest allies filed out in uncomfortable silence, Dumbledore remained alone in his office for the first time in decades, truly alone. The portraits watched him with judging eyes, and even Fawkes seemed to regard him with something less than his usual devotion. Outside, the revolution continued to build momentum, one shattered loyalty at a time. Chapter 5. Les Alliés, Inattendus, Unexpected Allies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Hogwarts grounds as students gathered in small clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. Their word of the French ministry's investigation had spread through the castle with the efficiency that only boarding school gossip could achieve, and the student body was beginning to fracture along lines that had nothing to do with house loyalty. Fleur found herself approached by the most unlikely allies as she sat beside the lake, watching the giant squid's tentacles break the surface in lazy spirals. The Weasley twins appeared as if from nowhere, a talent they'd perfected over 6 years of mischief-making, settling on either side of her with identical expressions of serious concern that looked foreign on their usually jovial faces. "We need to talk," Fred said without preamble, his voice lacking its usual playful tone. "About Harry," George added, and the name carried weight between them that Fleur hadn't expected. She studied them carefully. Throughout the tournament, the twins had maintained their usual irreverent attitude toward authority, but there was something different now, something purposeful. "What about Harry?" she asked. "The things you told the French ministry," Fred began, then paused as if gathering courage. "About how the adults have failed him." "You're not wrong." "We've been watching," George continued, and his voice carried a note of guilt. "For 3 years we've been watching, and we should have done something sooner." "Watching what?" Fleur leaned forward, sensing that whatever they were about to reveal would be significant. "The nightmares," Fred said simply. "Every year they get worse. Harry talks in his sleep, cries out sometimes, about his parents, about dying, about failing people. Ron pretends not to notice because it makes him uncomfortable, but we hear it from our dormitory. He never asks for help," George added. "Not once, in 3 years. Even when he's obviously hurt or scared or overwhelmed, he just accepts it, like he doesn't think he deserves better." Fleur felt her chest tighten. These young men, barely older than Harry himself, had been witnessing his distress for years, while the adults charged with his care remained willfully blind. "There's more," Fred said quietly. "The way he reacts to unexpected kindness, like he's suspicious of it, like he's waiting for the catch. And the way he assumes everything dangerous is his responsibility," George continued. "First year with the stone, second year with the chamber, third year with Sirius Black, or it never occurs to him that adults should be handling these things." "Because the adults never do," Fleur said, and it wasn't a question. "Exactly." Fred's expression darkened. "They let him face everything alone, and then act surprised when he keeps expecting to face everything alone." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation, and Fleur looked up to see Hermione Granger walking toward them with determined strides. Behind her, at a considerable distance, and looking deeply uncomfortable, came Ron Weasley. "Fred, George," Hermione said without preamble, "I need to know if you'll testify to the French ministry about what you've observed regarding Harry's treatment." "Already planning to," George replied, while Fred nodded agreement. "Good." Hermione's relief was palpable. "Because some people seem to think loyalty to Dumbledore is more important than Harry's welfare." This last comment was directed over her shoulder at Ron, whose ears had turned red in a way that suggested an argument had preceded this conversation. "Hermione, that's not fair," Ron protested, as he caught up to the group. "I'm not saying Dumbledore's perfect, but he's always looked out for Harry. By allowing him to face a dragon at 14, Hermione's voice rose. By placing him with relatives who starved and abused him. By letting him walk into mortal danger year after year with no proper training or support." "The training," Ron began, but Fred cut him off. "What training, Ron? Has anyone ever taught Harry proper defensive spells? Advanced combat magic? No trauma recovery techniques?" Fred's voice was sharper than Fleur had ever heard it. Or did they just throw him at problems and hope he'd muddle through? Ron opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, looking uncertain. "I've been thinking about it all day," George said quietly. "About how many times Harry's saved other people's lives, and how little anyone's done to actually prepare him for the dangers he keeps facing." "He saved Ginny in the Chamber of Secrets," Fred added, his voice heavy with a combination of gratitude and guilt. "Our sister would be dead if Harry hadn't gone down there. But he shouldn't have had to go. He was 12 years old. And now they're saying he has to die to stop you-know-who," Hermione's voice cracked. "That everything has been preparation for his eventual sacrifice. That's not protection, Ron. That's grooming." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Even Ron seemed shaken by its implications. A new voice interrupted from behind them. "Miss Granger is correct." They turned to see Draco Malfoy approaching, flanked by Blaise Zabini and Daphne Greengrass. The Slytherin contingent looked decidedly uncomfortable, but Draco's expression was grimly determined. "Malfoy," Ron said warily. "Weasley." Draco's usual sneer was absent. "I suppose you think I'm here to mock Potter or cause trouble, aren't you?" Fred asked, though his tone was more curious than hostile. "No." Draco's admission seemed to surprise even himself. "I'm here to offer testimony about the tournament irregularities that everyone seems determined to ignore." Fleur studied the young Slytherin with new interest. But what kind of irregularities? "The kind that were obvious to anyone paying attention," Draco replied. "Potter's name coming out of the goblet, despite him being underage and not entering. The dragon selection being obviously rigged to give him the most dangerous opponent, the second task being modified to specifically target his heroic tendencies." He paused, then added with characteristic bluntness, "I assumed it was favoritism. I thought Dumbledore was giving his precious Gryffindor advantages, disguised as challenges." "But it wasn't favoritism," Blaise said quietly. "It was systematic endangerment disguised as character building. We discussed it in our common room," Daphne added. "The patterns were too consistent to be coincidental, and someone was deliberately placing Potter in increasingly dangerous situations." "And you never said anything?" Hermione demanded. Draco's expression tightened. "To whom? The professors who were obviously complicit? The ministry officials who refused to investigate? We're Slytherins, Granger. No one listens to us when we raise concerns about Dumbledore's precious Gryffindors." It was a fair point, Fleur realized. The house prejudices that had seemed like mere school politics were actually preventing students from protecting each other when it mattered most. "But you're willing to testify now?" she asked. "Yes," Draco said simply. "Because whatever else Potter is, he doesn't deserve to be deliberately sacrificed by the adults who claim to protect him." The admission seemed to cost him something, and Fleur found herself reassessing her opinion of the young Slytherin. Perhaps there was more depth to him than his usual arrogance suggested. "There are others willing to speak out," Daphne added. "Cho Chang has been telling anyone who'll listen about Potter's obvious trauma after the Dementor attacks last year. She says he was clearly suffering from more than just the normal effects." "And the Hufflepuffs are furious about Cedric," Blaise said grimly. "They're saying that if the tournament was rigged from the beginning, then Cedric died for nothing more than Dumbledore's manipulation of Potter." The weight of mounting testimony was beginning to feel overwhelming. So many students had noticed, had been concerned, had wanted to help, but had been prevented by the very structures that were supposed to protect them all. "Professor Flitwick approached me this morning," Hermione said quietly. He wanted me to know that he'd documented his concerns about Harry's welfare in official reports to the Board of Governors, reports that were apparently buried and never acted upon. How many teachers knew? George asked, and his voice carried a note of horror. More than we thought, Hermione replied. Professor Flitwick says that several faculty members have been quietly fighting for better protections for Harry for years. They were just overruled. Repeatedly. A new voice interrupted from an unexpected source. That's quite correct, Miss Granger. They looked up to see nearly headless Nick floating towards them, his expression uncharacteristically serious. But the Gryffindor ghost rarely involved himself in student affairs beyond house pride and anniversary celebrations, but something about his demeanour suggested this was different. Sir Nicholas? Fred asked uncertainly. I've been asked to provide testimony to the French ministry, Nick replied, his translucent form shimmering in the afternoon light, about the things I've witnessed over the years, the things the living adults were too busy to notice. What kind of things? Fleur asked gently. Nick's expression grew sorrowful. A small boy crying alone in hidden corridors because he didn't think he deserved comfort. The same boy, years later, shouldering burdens no child should carry because no adult had taught him he had the right to refuse. I've watched Harry Potter sacrifice pieces of his childhood year after year, and I've watched the adults who claim to love him allow it to happen. The ghost's testimony was perhaps the most damning yet, because it came from someone who had nothing to gain and no agenda beyond the welfare of a student he'd watched grow up. Even some of the portraits are speaking out, Nick added quietly. Former headmasters who've grown uncomfortable with the current administration's methods. As if summoned by his words, a familiar voice called out from the direction of the castle. Mr. Potter's friends, a moment, if you please. They turned to see Professor Flitwick hurrying toward them, his usually cheerful expression grave with purpose. Professor? Hermione stood as he approached. I wanted you all to know, Flitwick said without preamble, that many of the faculty are prepared to testify about our concerns regarding Harry's welfare, concerns that have been systematically ignored for years. How many faculty members? Draco asked bluntly. More than half, Flitwick replied, and the number sent a shock through the assembled students. We've been meeting quietly since this morning, comparing our observations and our attempts to intervene. The pattern is undeniable. Why didn't you do something sooner? Ron asked, and for the first time his voice carried accusation rather than defense. Flitwick's expression grew pained. We tried, Mr. Weasley. Many times. But Dumbledore is a powerful man with many influential connections. Our concerns were dismissed as overcautiousness, our reports were buried, and our attempts to provide Harry with additional support were discouraged as unnecessary interference. The small charms professor looked older than his years as he continued. I've been teaching at Hogwarts for decades, and I've never seen a child so systematically failed by the adults responsible for his care. The French ministry's intervention may be our last chance to actually protect him. As the sun began to set over the lake, Fleur found herself surrounded by the most unlikely coalition she could have imagined. Gryffindors and Slytherins, students and teachers, even the castle's ghosts, all united by the recognition that Harry Potter had been betrayed by those who claimed to care for him most. The revolution was no longer just about international law or political maneuvering. It had become personal, a collective recognition that they had all failed to protect someone who had spent his entire magical life protecting others. And for the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Fleur began to believe they might actually succeed in giving Harry Potter something he had never truly possessed, a childhood worth preserving and adults worth trusting. Chapter 6. Le Dilemme de McGonagall, McGonagall's Dilemma. The Transfiguration classroom felt smaller than usual as McGonagall spread Harry's academic files across her desk, the parchments illuminated by the warm glow of evening sunlight filtering through tall windows. 4 years of carefully documented incidents, injury reports, and her own private observations lay before her like evidence in a trial she had never wanted to prosecute. As each document told a story she had lived through, but never truly examined as a complete narrative. The first-year incident report for Halloween. Mr. Potter suffered minor injuries while confronting Professor Quirrell, who was found to be possessed by you-know-who. Student displayed remarkable courage and resourcefulness. She remembered writing those words, remembered feeling proud of Harry's bravery. Now, reading them in the context of everything she'd learned today, they felt like a condemnation. Remarkable courage, from an 11-year-old child who should never have been in that situation in the first place. The second-year report was worse. Mr. Potter entered the Chamber of Secrets to rescue Miss Ginevra Weasley, successfully defeating a 1,000-year-old basilisk with minimal adult assistance. Once again, your student showed exceptional heroism under extraordinary circumstances. Exceptional heroism? At 12 years old, against a monster that could kill with a glance. McGonagall's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the third-year documentation. Mr. Potter successfully produced a corporeal Patronus to drive off multiple Dementors, threatening himself and his godfather. Students' advanced magical ability continues to develop under pressure. Under pressure. What a delicate way to describe systematic trauma. And finally, the preliminary report from last night's events. Mr. Potter returned from the third task, bearing witness to you-know-who's resurrection and the murder of Cedric Diggory. Student remains traumatized, but insists his account is accurate. Student remains traumatized. As if trauma were a temporary inconvenience, rather than the predictable result of 4 years of deliberate endangerment. The pattern was undeniable when laid out chronologically. Each incident escalated from the previous. Each report praised Harry's courage, while glossing over the adult failures that had made such courage necessary. And underneath it all, her own complicity in Dumbledore's systematic preparation of a child for sacrifice. She had known. Perhaps not consciously, perhaps not all at once, but some part of her had always known that Dumbledore's treatment of Harry was wrong, and she had chosen institutional loyalty over her duty to protect her student. A soft knock interrupted her self-recrimination. "Come," she called, hastily organizing the files. Captain Rousseau entered, followed by Marcel Dubois and, unexpectedly, to Fleur Delacour. The young Frenchwoman looked exhausted, but determined, her usually perfect composure showing stress fractures that spoke to the emotional toll of the day's revelations. "Professor McGonagall," Captain Rousseau said formally, "we hoped to discuss the next steps in our investigation with you." "Of course." McGonagall gestured to the chairs across from her desk, noting how Fleur positioned herself slightly apart from the officials, close enough to participate, but far enough to maintain her role as advocate rather than interrogator. "We've been reviewing international magical law regarding Mr. Potter's situation," Dubois began, consulting his ever-present notes. "Given the systematic nature of the endangerment and the clear conflict of interest regarding his current guardianship arrangements, we believe he qualifies for protected refugee status under Article 23 of the International Confederation's Child Welfare Accords." McGonagall's eyebrows rose. "Refugee status? That seems rather extreme." "Is it?" Captain Rousseau's voice was carefully neutral. "Professor, in your professional opinion, is Mr. Potter safe in his current living arrangements?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. McGonagall thought of Privet Drive, of the bars on Harry's windows that she'd seen during her surveillance before his first year, of his obvious malnutrition each September, his desperate gratitude for any kindness, his resigned acceptance of danger as normal. "No," she said quietly. "He is not safe." "Then refugee status is appropriate," Rousseau continued. "The French ministry is prepared to offer him temporary protection while a full investigation determines the best long-term arrangements for his care." What would that entail? McGonagall asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Removal from his current guardian's custody, Dubois replied. Placement with a qualified French family willing to provide appropriate care and protection. Access to proper trauma counseling and educational support. Most importantly, freedom from the adults who have systematically failed him. McGonagall closed her eyes briefly, seeing Harry as he'd looked that morning, small and pale and utterly resigned to whatever the adults around him decided to do with his life, never asking what he wanted, never expecting to be consulted about his own future. There would be, what resistance, she said carefully. From Headmaster Dumbledore, yes, Rousseau agreed. Which is why we need allies within the British magical establishment. People willing to put Mr. Potter's welfare above institutional loyalty. The implicit question was clear. McGonagall opened her eyes and met Captain Rousseau's gaze steadily. What do you need from me? Your files, Dubois said immediately. Your complete, unedited documentation of Mr. Potter's experiences at Hogwarts, your professional assessment of his treatment, and if necessary, your testimony before the International Confederation of Wizards. McGonagall looked down at the files spread across her desk, 4 years of carefully worded reports that praised Harry's heroism while ignoring the adults who had made such heroism necessary from a child. These files, she said slowly, that were written to portray the incidents in the most favourable light possible for the school's reputation. They don't tell the whole truth about Harry's treatment. Then tell us the whole truth now, Fleur said, quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Harry deserves to have someone speak honestly about what has been done to him. McGonagall felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of loyalty that had bound her for decades, replaced by something that felt cleaner and more vital. Duty. Not to an institution or a man, but to a child who had been entrusted to her care and failed by her choices. The whole truth, she repeated, and opened the first file. Is that Harry Potter has been systematically manipulated and endangered by the very people charged with protecting him, and starting with his placement with relatives we knew would abuse him, continuing through 4 years of deliberate exposure to mortal danger, and culminating in the revelation that all of this was preparation for his eventual sacrifice. She looked up at the French delegation, her expression resolute. I have been complicit in this through my silence. I will not be complicit any longer. Captain Rousseau leaned forward, her professional excitement barely contained. Professor, are you willing to provide formal testimony to that effect? Yes. The word came easier than McGonagall had expected. But first, I need to have one final conversation with Dumbledore. He deserves to know that his deputy headmistress can no longer support his methods. Is that wise? Dubois asked with concern. If he suspects you're cooperating with our investigation, let him suspect, McGonagall said with steel in her voice. I've spent too many years enabling him through my silence. It's time he understood the cost of his choices. An hour later, McGonagall stood once again in Dumbledore's circular office, but the dynamic had shifted fundamentally since their morning confrontation. Dumbledore sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his expression calm but watchful. The portraits maintained their usual pretense of sleep, though McGonagall suspected they were listening intently to every word. Minerva, Dumbledore said warmly, I hope you've had time to reconsider your position regarding the French ministry's intervention. I have, McGonagall replied, and her tone carried none of its usual deference. Whilst I've spent the evening reviewing Harry's complete academic file, every incident, every injury, every narrow escape from death. And what conclusion have you reached? That you have spent 4 years preparing a child for slaughter. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Not training him to survive, not teaching him to fight effectively, not building his confidence and skills, preparing him to accept death as inevitable and noble. Dumbledore's mask slipped slightly. The prophecy requires nothing of the sort, McGonagall cut him off. You've chosen to interpret it in the way that demands the least effort from you. It's easier to shape a martyr than to train a warrior. You do not understand the complexities. I understand that you placed a child with abusive relatives because you wanted him broken and desperate for approval. I understand that you allowed him to face mortal danger year after year because you wanted him to accept death as normal. I understand that you've convinced him his life has no value except as a weapon against Voldemort. McGonagall's voice rose with each accusation. What I don't understand is how you sleep at night. Dumbledore stood, his blue eyes flashing with something that was decidedly not grandfatherly benevolence. I have made difficult choices for the greater good. You have made convenient choices for your own peace of mind, McGonagall countered. Or the hard choice would have been finding a way to fulfill the prophecy while actually protecting Harry. The hard choice would have been training him properly while building his sense of self-worth. The hard choice would have been treating him as a person rather than a symbol. And if your hard choices led to Voldemort's victory, then at least Harry would have died knowing he was valued for himself, not just for his usefulness. McGonagall's voice broke slightly. At least he would have died having experienced love and protection and childhood, rather than systematic abuse disguised as character building. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of disappointment that might once have made her reconsider her position. I see the French have been very persuasive. The French didn't persuade me, Albus. Harry did. 4 years of watching him accept danger as normal, of seeing him expect betrayal from the adults who claim to care for him, of witnessing him shoulder burdens no child should carry because no one taught him he had the right to refuse. McGonagall straightened, her decision crystallizing into certainty. I failed him by trusting you. I won't fail him by continuing to enable you. Minerva, if you cooperate with this investigation, you will be betraying everything we've worked toward. Everything we've worked toward is the systematic destruction of a child's capacity for hope and happiness. McGonagall's voice was steady now, carrying the authority of decades of teaching and the conviction of finally choosing correctly. If that's betrayal, well, then I'm proud to betray it. She turned toward the door, then paused. I'll be requesting that the Board of Governors review your fitness as headmaster. I'll also be providing the French ministry with complete documentation of Harry's treatment during his time at Hogwarts. If you wish to contest either action, that is your right. You will regret this decision, Dumbledore said quietly. McGonagall looked back at him one final time. The only thing I regret is not making it sooner. She left him alone in his office, surrounded by the portraits of former headmasters who had begun to murmur among themselves with obvious disapproval. Whether their disapproval was directed at Dumbledore or herself, McGonagall no longer cared. She found Harry in the hospital wing, sitting by the window and staring out at the grounds where students were still gathering in their unprecedented coalition of concern. Fleur sat nearby, her presence a quiet comfort rather than an intrusion. Harry, McGonagall said softly, I owe you an apology. He looked up at her with those impossibly green eyes, so much older than they should be. Professor? I failed you. For 4 years, I chose institutional loyalty over my duty to protect you. I enabled your mistreatment through my silence. She sat in the chair across from him, her usually perfect posture showing the weight of her confession. I'm sorry. Harry stared at her for a long moment. You're apologizing to me. You sound surprised. Adults don't usually apologize to me, Harry said simply. They explain why what happened was necessary, or why I should be grateful, or why it was ultimately for my own good. But they don't apologize. The casual acceptance of adult failure in his voice broke McGonagall's heart. Then the adults in your life have failed you even more completely than I realized. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the grounds in shades of gold and crimson. Finally, Harry spoke again. "Professor, the French want to take me away. To France. How do you feel about that?" Harry was quiet for so long that McGonagall wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was very small. "I'm tired, Professor. I'm tired of being everyone's symbol and no one's child. I'm tired of adults making decisions about my life without asking what I want. I'm tired of being grateful for scraps of kindness when other children get love as their birthright." He looked up at her with eyes that held too much pain for 14 years. "I just want to grieve for Cedric without everyone treating his death as another lesson I needed to learn." McGonagall reached over and took his hand, the first purely nurturing gesture she'd ever offered him. "Then that's what you should do, Harry. Grieve. Heal. Learn what it means to be a child, protected by adults instead of used by them. You think I should go with them?" "I think you should choose whatever will make you feel safe and valued," McGonagall replied. "For once in your life, choose based on what you need, rather than what others expect from you." Harry squeezed her hand, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked like the 14-year-old boy he actually was, rather than the symbol he'd been forced to become. Outside the window, the revolution continued to build momentum, but in the quiet of the hospital wing, something simpler and more important was happening. A child was finally being offered the protection he should have received from the beginning. And perhaps it wasn't too late, after all. Chapter 7. La vérité sur les Dursley. The truth about the Dursleys. The morning of June 26th dawned grey and overcast, as if the Scottish sky itself reflected the sombre mood that had settled over Hogwarts. Harry sat in a conjured, comfortable chair in Professor McGonagall's office, no longer relegated to the hospital wing, but still under careful observation. Across from him sat Dr. Margot Beaumont, the French Ministry's child welfare specialist, whose gentle demeanour and professional competence offered a stark contrast to the institutional indifference he'd grown accustomed to. Dr. Beaumont was perhaps 50, with greying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She carried no wand that Harry could see, but her magical presence felt different from the other officials, warmer, more focused on healing than investigation. "Harry," she said softly, her English carrying only the faintest trace of French accent, "I want you to understand that this conversation is not about gathering evidence for political purposes. This is about understanding what you have experienced so that we can help you heal from it." Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't need to heal from anything. I'm fine." "Doctor." Beaumont's expression remained neutral, but Harry caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd heard those words many times before from children who were decidedly not fine. "Perhaps we could start with something simple," she suggested. "Can you tell me about your earliest memory of living with the Dursleys?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact, in the way that suggested he'd learned to discuss trauma as if it were mundane. "The cupboard under the stairs. That was my room until I got my Hogwarts letter. It was small, dark. Sometimes I couldn't tell if it was day or night." "How long did you live in the cupboard, Harry?" 10 years. The casual way he said it made Dr. Beaumont's pen still against her parchment. "From when I was 1 until I was 11. 10 years, she repeated carefully. "And during that time, were you ever allowed into other parts of the house? For chores, cooking, cleaning, garden work? But I had to be quiet. Aunt Petunia said I wasn't to make noise or cause trouble or remind them I existed." Harry's voice grew smaller. "Sometimes I forgot that rule and got locked in for days without food." Dr. Beaumont set down her quill and leaned forward slightly. "Harry, what you're describing is severe neglect and abuse. You understand that, don't you?" Harry looked up at her with genuine confusion. But it was just normal. That was just how things were. No, Harry, it was not normal. Children are supposed to have their own rooms, regular meals, kindness from the adults caring for them. What you experienced was profoundly wrong. The word seemed to hit Harry like a physical blow. He stared at her for a long moment, and Dr. Beaumont could see him struggling to reconcile this new information with a lifetime of being told he deserved his treatment. But Professor Dumbledore said, Harry began, then stopped. What did Professor Dumbledore say? That they were family. That blood protection meant I had to stay with them. That it was for my own good. Harry's voice cracked slightly. He said the sacrifices were worth it to keep me safe. Dr. Beaumont's expression darkened. Harry, did Professor Dumbledore ever explain what these sacrifices were supposed to accomplish? Why your suffering was necessary for your protection? He said my mother's love lived in my aunt's blood. That as long as I called Privet Drive home, that Voldemort couldn't touch me there. Harry looked up at her with eyes that held too much pain. But Voldemort never came to Privet Drive. The Dursleys were the ones who hurt me. The simple logic of it was devastating. A child had endured a decade of abuse for protection against a threat that never materialized in the place where he needed protection most. Can you tell me more about the physical conditions of your confinement? Dr. Beaumont asked gently. The cupboard, the restrictions on food, any other punishments? Harry's account, delivered in the same flat tone he might use to recite homework assignments, painted a picture of systematic cruelty that made even the experienced child welfare specialist struggle to maintain her professional composure. Bars on his bedroom window, locks on his door, meals withheld for days at a time, the social isolation so complete that he'd never had a friend before Hogwarts, physical labor from the age of 5, emotional abuse designed to convince him he was worthless, unwanted, a burden to be endured rather than a child to be cherished. Harry, Dr. Beaumont said when he'd finished, did any adults ever visit your home? Anyone who might have seen these conditions? Mrs. Figg, sometimes. She lived down the street and watched me when the Dursleys went out. Harry's expression brightened slightly. She was not cruel, just boring. She made me look at pictures of her cats and fed me stale cake. Dr. Beaumont made a note. Anyone else? Teachers from my primary school, when they tried to ask about bruises or why I was always so thin. But Uncle Vernon always had explanations, and they seemed to accept them. Harry paused, thinking. Or there were some people in robes who came by sometimes, but they never talked to me. They just watched from across the street or from parked cars. People in robes? Dr. Beaumont's voice sharpened. Watching you? I thought I was imagining it when I was little, but after I learned about magic, I realized they were probably wizards. Keeping an eye on me, maybe. The implications were staggering. If wizards had been monitoring Harry's situation and reporting back to the magical authorities, then his abuse hadn't been hidden or unknown. It had been observed and permitted. A knock at the office door interrupted the session. Captain Rousseau entered with Marcel Dubois, both looking grim in a way that suggested their own investigations had yielded disturbing results. Dr. Beaumont, Captain Rousseau said formally, we need to discuss what we've discovered at Privet Drive. Dr. Beaumont glanced at Harry, who had gone very still at the mention of his former home. Perhaps we could continue this conversation later, Harry. You've been very brave today. No, Harry said quietly. I want to hear what they found. It's my life they're talking about. The adults exchanged glances, but something in Harry's voice, a new note of authority, perhaps, born from finally being heard rather than dismissed, made them nod their agreement. We dispatched a team to document the physical conditions at Privet Drive, Captain Rousseau began. The evidence of your confinement is extensive. She opened a folder and withdrew several magical photographs that moved with the unsettling quality of documented evidence rather than cherished memories. At the cupboard under the stairs, impossibly small and filled with broken toys and old cleaning supplies. Harry's second bedroom with its barred windows and multiple locks. The garden shed where he'd been forced to sleep during particularly severe punishments. The magical residue suggests long-term monitoring charms, Dubois added, consulting his notes. Someone placed extensive surveillance magic on that house, Harry. Magic that would have tracked your physical condition, your emotional state, even your magical development. Harry stared at the photographs of his childhood prison, his expression unreadable. Someone was watching me the whole time. Multiple someones, Captain Rousseau confirmed. We interviewed your neighbour, Mrs. Figg. She was, reluctant to speak at first. What did she say? That she was placed there by Professor Dumbledore specifically to monitor your situation. She reported regularly on your treatment, your health, your apparent adjustment to your circumstances. Captain Rousseau's voice carried barely controlled anger. She begged to be allowed to intervene multiple times. She was ordered not to. The betrayal hit Harry like a physical blow. Mrs. Figg, who he'd thought was simply a boring neighbour, had been a spy placed to watch his suffering without alleviating it. She wanted to help? Harry's voice was very small. Desperately, Dr. Beaumont said gently. According to her testimony, she requested permission to provide you with better food, warmer clothing, even just basic kindness. She was told that interfering with your character development would be dangerous for your magical protection. Character development, Harry repeated, and there was something dangerous in his tone. They called my abuse character development. The monitoring charms tell an even more disturbing story, Dubois continued. We found records, Harry. Detailed magical documentation of every injury, every punishment, every day you went without food. Dumbledore didn't just know about your abuse, he was documenting it. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Harry's increasingly rapid breathing. Dr. Beaumont moved her chair closer, recognizing the signs of an approaching panic attack. Harry, I need you to breathe with me, she said calmly. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. But Harry wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on some point in the middle distance, and his voice, when he spoke, was hollow with devastating realization. He knew. All of it. Every time Uncle Vernon hit me, every time they locked me up, every time I went to bed hungry. He knew, and he chose to let it happen. I'm afraid it gets worse, Captain Rousseau said reluctantly. We found correspondence in the Ministry archives, 3 separate attempts by concerned officials to investigate your living situation, all blocked by direct intervention from Dumbledore. She handed Harry a stack of official parchments, their formal language doing nothing to soften the impact of their contents. A concerned healer who'd noticed Harry's malnutrition during a routine magical accident response. A ministry social worker who'd received reports about a magical child living in substandard conditions. An Auror who'd questioned why surveillance was being maintained on a minor without protective intervention. All of them had been reassured that Harry Potter was safe, well cared for, and that the unusual circumstances were necessary for his magical protection. All of them had been discouraged from pursuing their concerns further. They tried to help me, Harry whispered, staring at the papers. People tried to help me, and he stopped them. Another knock at the door interrupted the devastating revelations. This time it was Arthur and Molly Weasley, both looking haggard and years older than they had 2 days ago. We heard, Arthur said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, about what they found, about the monitoring, the blocked investigations. Molly's eyes were red-rimmed with tears. Harry, dear, I need to tell you something, about all the times I wanted to bring you home with us. Harry looked up at her with desperate hope, as if her words might somehow soften the impact of everything else he'd learned. Every summer, Molly continued, her voice breaking. Every time we heard you were spending the holidays alone, Every time you looked so thin and tired when you came to the burrow, I begged Arthur to let us take you in properly, to apply for guardianship. And? Harry's voice was barely audible. Dumbledore visited us, Arthur said, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by bitter anger. Every single time. He always had reasons why it wouldn't be safe, why the protection at Privet Drive was irreplaceable, why removing you from your relatives would put you in terrible danger. We believed him, Molly said through her tears. We trusted him when he said your suffering was necessary, when he said interfering would make things worse. She reached for Harry's hands. I'm so sorry, dear. We should have fought harder. We should have ignored him and taken you anyway. Harry pulled his hands free, not in anger, but in the careful self-protection of someone who had learned not to depend on adult promises. How many people knew? He asked, his voice steady now, with the artificial calm of someone pushed beyond their emotional limits. How many people watched me suffer and decided it was acceptable? The question hung in the air, and none of the adults could meet his eyes. Too many, Dr. Beaumont said finally, her professional composure cracking. Far too many. Harry stood abruptly. They're walking to the window where he could see other students moving freely around the grounds, children who had never doubted their right to protection, to kindness, to childhood itself. Dr. Beaumont, he said without turning around, when you said this was about helping me heal, did you mean it? Yes, Harry, absolutely. Then get me away from here. His voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. Away from all of them. The people who watched, the people who knew, the people who chose to let it happen because it was convenient for their plans. He turned back to face the room, and Dr. Beaumont was struck by how much older he looked than he had just hours before. The last vestiges of childlike trust in adult protection had been stripped away, leaving behind someone who would never again accept suffering as necessary or inevitable. And I want to go to France, Harry said clearly. I want to be somewhere where adults don't think child abuse is character development. In the silence that followed, Dr. Beaumont realized she was witnessing something both heartbreaking and hopeful. The moment when Harry Potter stopped being a victim and started choosing his own protection. It was, perhaps, the first truly free choice he had ever been allowed to make. Chapter 8. L'Ultimatum, the Ultimatum. The great hall had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, its usual warmth replaced by the cold formality of international diplomacy. 3 distinct groups occupied the vast space. The French delegation at one end, their blue robes and official portfolios arranged with military precision. The British ministry officials clustered nervously around Cornelius Fudge in the centre, and Dumbledore standing alone near the staff table, his usual grandfatherly demeanour replaced by something harder and more calculating. Harry sat between Fleur and Dr. Beaumont at a small table that had been conjured for the proceedings, feeling simultaneously like the most important person in the room and completely powerless. Every decision being debated concerned his life, his future, his very survival, yet he remained a spectator to adult machinations that would determine his fate. Captain Rousseau rose from her seat, her voice carrying the weight of official authority as she addressed the assembled crowd. Minister Fudge, Headmaster Dumbledore, members of the Hogwarts Board of Governors, she began, nodding to each group in turn. The French Ministry of Magic hereby presents a formal ultimatum regarding the welfare of Harry Potter, a minor who has been systematically endangered through the negligence of his current guardians. She withdrew an official document from her portfolio, its parchment gleaming with the seals and signatures that marked it as binding international law. Under Article 23 of the International Confederation of Wizards Child Protection Accords, and based on extensive evidence of systematic abuse and endangerment, we demand that Harry Potter be released into protective custody within 24 hours of this declaration. Failure to comply will result in formal charges being filed with the International Confederation and potential sanctions against the British Ministry of Magic. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ghosts seemed to have paused their eternal wandering to witness this unprecedented confrontation. Fudge sputtered to life first, his face cycling through shades of red that would have been comical under different circumstances. "This is outrageous. The British ministry will not be dictated to by foreign powers regarding the welfare of British citizens. Mr. Potter's welfare is not a matter of national sovereignty," Marcel Dubois replied coolly, consulting his own documents. "Child protection transcends political boundaries. The evidence we have gathered, evidence gathered through illegal surveillance and unauthorized interrogation," Fudge interrupted, his voice rising to near hysterical levels. "This entire investigation has been conducted without proper authorization from the British ministry." Dumbledore stepped forward, and Harry was struck by how much smaller he seemed than usual. The magnificent beard and robes that had once made him appear larger than life now seemed like theatrical props on a diminished man. "If I may," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying its familiar note of patient authority, "I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding regarding my guardianship of Harry. As his magical guardian, appointed by his parents' will—" "Actually, Headmaster," Captain Rousseau interrupted, producing another document from her seemingly endless portfolio. "Our legal research indicates that you were never formally appointed as Mr. Potter's magical guardian." The statement hit the room like a thunderbolt. Even Fudge looked startled. "That's impossible," Dumbledore said, though uncertainty crept into his voice for the first time. "What I have been responsible for Harry's welfare since his parents' death." "You have exercised authority over Mr. Potter," Dubois corrected, "but our examination of British magical law reveals that you never completed the formal adoption process required for magical guardianship. When you placed Mr. Potter with non-magical relatives, his guardianship automatically reverted to the state." McGonagall, who had been sitting with the Board of Governors, leaned forward with sharp interest. "Are you saying that Dumbledore has had no legal authority over Harry's placement all these years?" "Precisely," Captain Rousseau confirmed, "which means that every decision regarding Mr. Potter's welfare, his living arrangements, his education, his exposure to danger, has been made without proper legal standing." The implications were staggering. Now, not only had Harry been systematically endangered, but the person making those decisions had no legal right to make them in the first place. "This is preposterous," Dumbledore said, though his usual confidence was notably absent. "I have acted in loco parentis for 14 years. The magical community has recognized my authority." "The magical community assumed you had proper authorization," Board Governor Amelia Bones interrupted, rising from her seat with the authority of someone accustomed to legal proceedings. "You allowed that assumption to continue without correction. That constitutes fraud, Headmaster." The political crisis was escalating beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun as a welfare investigation was becoming a constitutional crisis that threatened to topple one of the most powerful figures in British magical society. Furthermore, Dr. Beaumont added quietly, "Our psychological evaluation of Mr. Potter reveals trauma consistent with systematic emotional manipulation designed to create dependency and compliance. The pattern suggests deliberate grooming for sacrifice rather than protective guardianship." Harry flinched at the clinical description of his experiences. Hearing his entire childhood reduced to psychological terminology made him feel exposed and vulnerable in a way that was almost worse than the physical evidence of his abuse. Fleur reached over and squeezed his hand gently, her touch grounding him in the present moment. "Oh, you do not have to listen to this if it is too much," she murmured in French, knowing he would understand even if others couldn't follow the rapid exchange. "I need to hear it," Harry replied in the same language. "I need to know what they're fighting over." "They are fighting over your right to be safe," Fleur said simply. "Something you should never have had to fight for in the first place." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a new voice from the entrance to the great hall. "Perhaps," said Apolline Delacour as she swept into the room with her husband beside her, "we can resolve this more simply than anyone has suggested." The effect of Apolline's entrance was immediate and profound. Her Vila heritage made her naturally commanding. But there was something more in her bearing today. The righteous fury of a mother protecting a child, even if that child wasn't technically her own. Madame Delacour, Captain Rousseau acknowledged formally. You wish to address the assembly? I did. Apolline moved to the center of the room, her voice carrying clearly to every corner. My husband and I wish to formally request temporary guardianship of Harry Potter under international law, citing the life debt incurred when he saved our daughter's life during the second task of the Triwizard Tournament. The claim sent murmurs through the assembled officials. Life debt was ancient magic, older than most modern laws, and binding in ways that transcended political authority. The life debt claim would need to be verified, Fudge said weakly, clearly grasping for any way to maintain some control over the situation. Marcel Dubois smiled with professional satisfaction. Already done, Minister. The Triwizard Cup retained magical residue from the tournament tasks. Our analysis confirms that Mr. Potter not only saved Miss Delacour's life during the second task, but went beyond the requirements to ensure the safety of our daughter Gabrielle as well. A life debt freely given and acknowledged, Apolline continued, creates obligations that supersede normal guardianship law. We are prepared to provide Mr. Potter with the protection and care that has been systematically denied to him. Harry looked up at the elegant French woman with something approaching wonder. Throughout this entire ordeal, adults had fought over him, debated his future, made decisions about his welfare, but none of them had simply offered to protect him without agenda or condition. What would that entail? Harry found himself asking, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet hall. Monsieur Delacour stepped forward, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by gentle authority. It would mean coming to live with our family in France, Harry, receiving proper medical care for both your physical and emotional injuries, attending a school where your safety is prioritized over your symbolic value. Most importantly, being treated as a child who deserves protection rather than a weapon to be wielded. The offer was everything Harry hadn't dared to dream of. Safety, kindness, the chance to be ordinary rather than constantly exceptional. But years of disappointment had taught him to be cautious of promises that seemed too good to be true. And what would you want in return? Harry asked, his wariness evident. Apolline's expression softened with genuine maternal warmth. Nothing, mon coeur. You would be family. Family protects each other. It does not keep ledgers of debt and obligation. The simple declaration hit Harry like a physical blow. He'd spent so many years being told that every kindness came with a price, every protection required sacrifice, that the concept of unconditional care seemed foreign. The choice, ultimately, must be Mr. Potter's, Captain Rousseau said formally. He has the right to accept or refuse the offer of protection. All eyes turned to Harry, and he felt the weight of every gaze in the room. For the first time in his life, as a decision about his future was actually being left to him. Not manipulated or coerced, not presented as the only option for some greater good, but offered as a genuine choice between alternatives. Harry began, then stopped. The magnitude of the decision was overwhelming. Everything he'd ever known, Hogwarts, his friends, the magical world that had shaped him, would be left behind. But everything he'd ever known had also systematically failed to protect him. You don't have to decide right now, Dr. Beaumont said gently. This is the most important decision of your life. You should take time to consider all the implications. How much time? Harry asked. The ultimatum allows 24 hours, Captain Rousseau replied, but we can request an extension if needed. Dumbledore stepped forward, and for a moment his mask of grandfatherly concern slipped back into place. Harry, my boy, surely you understand that leaving Britain would put you in terrible danger. The protections here have never protected me from anything that actually threatened me, Harry interrupted, and his voice carried a new note of authority that silenced the room. The Dursleys hurt me for 10 years under your protection. I've nearly died 4 times at Hogwarts under your protection. I was kidnapped and tortured last night under your protection." He stood, facing the man who had shaped his entire magical existence. "So when you talk about protections, Professor, I have to ask, protection from what? And for whom?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Harry realized that for the first time in his life, he was demanding answers rather than accepting explanations. "The prophecy requires," Dumbledore began. "The prophecy requires nothing that depends on my suffering," Harry cut him off again. "If I have to face Voldemort eventually, I'd rather do it as someone who's been trained and protected and cared for, not someone who's been broken down and molded into a willing sacrifice." He turned to address the entire room, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I need time to think about this decision, but I want everyone here to understand something. For the first time in my life, adults are asking what I want instead of telling me what I need. That alone makes me more inclined to trust the French offer than anything I've been promised by the people who've been making decisions about my life without my input." With that, Harry walked out of the Great Hall, leaving behind a room full of adults to debate the political implications of a 14-year-old boy finally demanding the right to choose his own protection. As he made his way to the lake where he could think in peace, Harry realized that regardless of what he ultimately decided, something fundamental had changed. He was no longer willing to be a passive victim of other people's choices, and that, perhaps, was the most important transformation of all. Chapter 9. Le choix de Harry, Harry's choice. The night was restless and filled with whispered conversations. Harry had retreated to the Gryffindor dormitory after the confrontation in the Great Hall, seeking the familiar comfort of his 4-poster bed. But sleep eluded him entirely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the adults arguing over his future, heard the clinical descriptions of his abuse, felt the weight of a choice that would determine the rest of his life. Around midnight, Ron appeared at his bedside, looking more uncertain than Harry had ever seen him. "Can't sleep either?" Ron whispered, mindful of their sleeping dorm-mates. "Not really." Harry sat up, grateful for the companionship. "Keep thinking about everything." Ron perched on the edge of Harry's bed, his freckled face creased with worry. "You're not really going to leave, are you? I mean, this is your home. Hogwarts, Britain. All your friends are here." The desperate note in Ron's voice made Harry's chest tighten. He'd known this conversation was coming, had been dreading it, in fact. "I don't know yet," Harry said honestly. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But if you leave," Ron's voice cracked slightly, "what happens to us? To our friendship? We've been through everything together, Harry. First year with the stone, second year with the chamber, third year with Sirius. We're supposed to stick together." "Ron," Harry said gently, "I'm not abandoning you. I'm trying to figure out how to survive. You've survived everything so far. Have I?" The question came out sharper than Harry had intended. "Ron, I've been systematically abused for 13 years. I've nearly died 4 times in 4 years at school. Yesterday I learned that dozens of adults knew about my suffering and chose to allow it because it was convenient for their plans." His voice grew quieter. "I'm not sure that surviving is the same thing as living." Ron stared at him for a long moment, and Harry could see him struggling to process concepts that challenged everything he'd believed about Harry's life. Ron began, then stopped. "I'm scared of losing you." "You're not going to lose me," Harry said, though he wasn't entirely sure what that promise meant in practical terms. "But I need to think about what's best for me, not just what's easiest for everyone else." Ron nodded reluctantly, though his expression remained troubled. "Whatever you decide, you know I'll support you, right? Even if I don't understand it." The conversation was interrupted by the soft pad of footsteps on the dormitory stairs. Hermione appeared in the doorway, her bushy hair more disheveled than usual and her arms full of books. I thought I might find you both awake, she said without preamble, settling herself on Ron's bed across from them. I've been researching international magical law and child protection statutes. Of course you have, Ron said, with fond exasperation. Harry, I need you to listen to me, Hermione continued, her voice carrying the determined tone she used when she believed she was absolutely right about something. From a purely logical standpoint, the French offer represents your best chance at safety and normal development. She opened the largest of her books, revealing pages covered with her meticulous notes. The Delacours have no political agenda regarding you. They're not invested in the prophecy or the war against Voldemort. They're offering protection based on life debt and genuine care, but not manipulation. She looked up at Harry with earnest brown eyes. Most importantly, they're offering you the chance to heal from your trauma in an environment where your welfare is the primary concern. But what about the prophecy? Harry asked. What about Voldemort? What about them? Hermione replied pragmatically. Harry, you've faced Voldemort 4 times already, and not once did Dumbledore's protections actually protect you. If anything, they put you in more danger by making you unprepared and isolated. She leaned forward, her expression intense. If you do have to face Voldemort eventually, and I'm not convinced that the prophecy means what Dumbledore thinks it means, wouldn't you rather do it as someone who's been properly trained and emotionally healthy? Or someone who's learned that their life has value beyond their usefulness as a weapon? Harry found himself nodding despite his reservations. Hermione's logical analysis aligned with his own instinctive feelings about the choice he faced. Besides, she added with a slight smile, France isn't on the other side of the world. We can write letters, visit during holidays. You wouldn't be cutting yourself off from everyone who cares about you. The dormitory door creaked open again, admitting the Weasley twins with their characteristic lack of concern for established bedtimes. Midnight conference? Fred asked, settling himself on the floor with easy familiarity. We heard whispers about international incidents and life-changing decisions, George added, mirroring his brother's position. Or thought we should offer our wisdom. Your wisdom? Ron asked skeptically. Our wisdom, Fred confirmed solemnly, is that Harry should do whatever will make him happiest. Revolutionary concept, we know, George continued, but we've given it considerable thought. For all of 30 seconds, Fred acknowledged cheerfully. But seriously, Harry, you've spent your entire life doing what other people expected of you. Maybe it's time to try doing what you want for yourself. And what if I don't know what I want? Harry asked, feeling younger than his 14 years. Then you experiment, the twins said in unison, their voices unusually gentle. You try something new, see how it feels, and adjust accordingly. That's what normal people get to do. Their matter-of-fact approach to his dilemma was oddly comforting. Unlike the adults who spoke in terms of destiny and greater good, the twins treated his choice as simply that, a choice with no cosmic implications beyond his own well-being. Another set of footsteps announced a new visitor. Neville appeared in the doorway, looking more determined than Harry had ever seen him. Sorry to interrupt, Neville said quietly, but I wanted to tell Harry something about adults making decisions for your own good. He joined the group, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the twins. My grandmother has made a lot of decisions about my life that she claimed were for my benefit. Keeping me away from my parents, enrolling me in schools that weren't right for me, discouraging my interests because they didn't fit her idea of what I should be. Neville's voice grew stronger as he continued. But I spent years accepting it, because I thought she knew better. But recently I've started to wonder, were those decisions really about what was best for me? Or were they about what was most convenient for her? What allowed her to maintain control? He looked directly at Harry. From what I've heard about your situation, it sounds like Dumbledore has been making the same kind of for-your-own-good decisions. Maybe it's time to find out what decisions you would make for yourself. The quiet wisdom in Neville's words hit Harry like a revelation. Here was someone else who had been shaped by adults, who claimed to know what was best, who had learned to question those claims and seek his own path. "Thanks, Neville," Harry said simply. "That actually helps a lot." The group eventually dispersed, but leaving Harry alone with his thoughts as dawn approached. He found himself drawn to the common room windows, watching the sun rise over the grounds of the castle that had been his first real home. He was still standing there when Fleur appeared in the portrait hole, looking as though she hadn't slept much either. "I hoped I might find you here," she said softly, joining him at the window. "Are you ready to talk about what accepting our offer would actually mean?" Harry nodded, appreciating her directness. Throughout this entire crisis, Fleur had been the most honest person about both the benefits and the costs of the choices he faced. "If you come with us," Fleur began, "you would be part of our family. Not a guest, not a burden, not a symbol. Family. That means we would care for you, but it also means we would expect things from you." "What kinds of things?" "Engagement with life," Fleur replied without hesitation. "We would expect you to attend therapy to heal from your trauma. We would expect you to participate in family activities, to form relationships, to pursue interests and hobbies that have nothing to do with your magical destiny. We would expect you to be a 14-year-old boy learning to become a healthy adult, rather than a weapon being prepared for sacrifice." She turned to face him fully. "We would not hide you away or let you withdraw from the world. We would push you to grow and heal and discover who you are when you're not constantly in survival mode. That might be harder in some ways than what you're used to." "How so?" Harry asked, intrigued despite himself. "That's because healing requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that you deserve better than you've received. It requires building relationships based on trust rather than necessity." Fleur's voice was gentle but unflinching. "It requires giving up the familiar patterns of suffering that have shaped your identity, and learning to exist as someone who is valued simply for being himself." The description was both terrifying and appealing. Harry had never considered that recovery might be its own kind of challenge, requiring courage of a different sort than facing dark wizards or dangerous creatures. "And if I decided later that I wanted to return to Britain, to face whatever I need to face here?" "Then we would support that decision too," Fleur said simply. "But you would make it as someone who had experienced genuine protection and care, or someone who understood that they had choices beyond sacrifice and survival." After Fleur left, Harry found himself wandering the castle corridors as morning gave way to afternoon. He eventually made his way to the Great Hall, where a small memorial had been erected for Cedric Diggory. Fresh flowers surrounded a photograph of Cedric smiling in his Hufflepuff Quidditch robes, and Harry sat before it in contemplative silence. "I don't know what you'd tell me to do," Harry said quietly to the photograph. "You were good at making the right choices, at being decent and fair and normal." He imagined Cedric's voice, warm with the kindness that had made him so well liked. "I'd tell you to choose life, Harry. Not survival, not duty, not sacrifice. Life, or the kind where you get to be happy sometimes." The imagined conversation brought tears to Harry's eyes, but also a kind of clarity he hadn't expected. "Professor Dumbledore has been looking for you." Harry turned to find McGonagall approaching, her expression unreadable. "Has he?" Harry said, with notable lack of enthusiasm. "He's waiting in his office. But before you go—" McGonagall sat beside him on the bench, her usually perfect posture relaxed. "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I support it. For the first time in your life, adults are asking what you want instead of telling you what you need. That's a gift you should treasure. Even if it means leaving Britain? Leaving Hogwarts?" McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. "Harry, I became a teacher because I believed in protecting and nurturing young minds. Or for 4 years I failed you by choosing institutional loyalty over that mission. If leaving Britain is what it takes for you to receive the childhood and education you deserve, then leaving Britain is what you should do." Her words gave Harry the strength he needed to face Dumbledore's final appeal. He found the headmaster in his office, looking older and more fragile than Harry had ever seen him. The portraits of former headmasters were notably silent, and even Fawkes seemed subdued. "Harry, my boy," Dumbledore said with a shadow of his former warmth, "I hoped we might have one final conversation before you make your decision." "All right," Harry replied, though he remained standing near the door. "The protections I have woven around you, the blood magic that connects you to your mother's sacrifice, these are not mere theories. Or Harry, they are the reason Voldemort cannot touch you, cannot find you when you are with your family." "But he did touch me," Harry replied calmly. "In the graveyard. He used my blood to resurrect himself, and he's never come looking for me at Privet Drive anyway. The Dursleys were the ones who hurt me there." Dumbledore's expression flickered with something that might have been frustration. "The protections are more complex than you understand." "Then why didn't you teach me to understand them?" Harry interrupted. "Why didn't you teach me to defend myself properly? Why didn't you prepare me to face the dangers you knew I'd encounter?" "I sought to preserve your innocence." "You sought to preserve my ignorance," Harry corrected, and his voice carried a new note of authority. "There's a difference, Professor, and I'm done pretending there isn't." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, studying Harry with those penetrating blue eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. "If you leave Britain, Harry, you may be condemning our entire world to darkness. And if I stay," Harry replied, "I may be condemning myself to a life of suffering, justified by other people's definition of greater good." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For the first time in my life, I'm being asked to choose based on what I need rather than what other people expect from me. I'm not going to waste that opportunity." As he left Dumbledore's office for what might be the final time, Harry felt something settle into place inside his chest. Not the heavy weight of destiny he'd carried for so long, but something lighter and more vital. Choice, or agency, the right to determine his own path forward. That evening, as the French delegation prepared to depart with or without him, Harry made his decision known. "I'll go with you," he told the Delacours, his voice steady with newfound certainty. "Not forever, necessarily, but long enough to heal, to learn what it feels like to be protected rather than used, to discover who I am when I'm not constantly in survival mode." The relief on Fleur's face was profound, matched by her parents' warm smiles of welcome. "But I have one condition," Harry continued. "This is temporary. When I'm ready, when I've healed enough to make decisions from strength rather than desperation, I want the right to choose my own path forward, whether that's staying in France, returning to Britain, or something else entirely." "Of course," Apolline said warmly. "You will always have choices with us, Harry. That is what family means." As Harry packed his few belongings that night, he realized he wasn't just choosing a new home. He was choosing to believe that he deserved better than he'd received, that his life had value beyond his usefulness to others, that healing was possible even after years of systematic harm. It was, perhaps, the most courageous choice he had ever made. And for the first time since his parents died, Harry Potter went to sleep believing he might actually have a future worth living. Chapter 10. Les conséquences, the consequences. The morning of June 27th dawned with the kind of chaos that only comes from a political scandal of international proportions. Harry stood at the window of the guest quarters the French delegation had arranged, watching owls stream across the Scottish sky in unprecedented numbers. Each bird carried news, opinions, threats, or support regarding the decision he had made less than 12 hours ago. The magical world, it seemed, had opinions about where Harry Potter should live, and they were not shy about expressing them. "The morning papers," Fleur announced, entering with a stack of newspapers that rustled ominously as she set them on the small table. "Perhaps you should sit down before reading them." Harry took her advice, settling into the conjured armchair that Dr. Beaumont had provided for their continuing sessions. The top paper was the Daily Prophet, its headline screaming in letters that seemed to vibrate with indignation. "Boy who lived kidnapped by foreign interests." "Kidnapped," Harry repeated flatly, scanning the article beneath. Rita Skeeter's byline accompanied text that painted him as a vulnerable child, manipulated by French agents with unclear motives, while Dumbledore was portrayed as a grieving guardian whose attempts to protect his ward had been thwarted by international interference. "The French papers tell a different story," Fleur said, indicating the other publications. Le Monde Magique calls it un acte de protection nécessaire, a necessary act of protection. The German Zauberer Zeitung has an editorial calling for a complete review of British child welfare policies. Harry picked up the French paper, his improving grasp of the language allowing him to understand the sympathetic coverage. Where the prophet painted him as a victim of foreign manipulation, Le Monde Magique portrayed him as a brave young man finally receiving the protection he deserved. "It's strange," Harry mused, "how the same story can be told so differently depending on who's telling it." "That," said Captain Rousseau as she entered the room with Marcel Dubois in tow, "is precisely why we're here. Mr. Potter, I wanted to inform you of the immediate consequences of your decision." She settled across from him, her official demeanor softer than it had been during the investigation, but still carrying the weight of serious business. "Minister Fudge has threatened to impose diplomatic sanctions against France, claiming we have violated British sovereignty. However, the International Confederation of Wizards announced this morning that they will be conducting their own investigation into British Ministry child protection failures." "What does that mean?" Harry asked. "It means," Dubois replied with professional satisfaction, "that this incident has exposed systemic problems that go far beyond your individual case. Other countries are beginning to question whether Britain can be trusted to protect its magical children." The implications were staggering. Harry's personal decision to seek protection had become a catalyst for examining the entire British magical child welfare system. "There's more," Captain Rousseau continued. "The Hogwarts Board of Governors held an emergency session last night. By a vote of 8-4, they have passed a motion of no confidence in Dumbledore's leadership. Professor McGonagall has been appointed acting headmistress, pending a full review." Harry felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. He'd never intended to bring down Dumbledore. He'd simply wanted to escape a situation that was harming him. But perhaps that was how change happened. One person refusing to accept mistreatment, causing others to examine their own complicity. What about Dumbledore? What will happen to him? "That remains to be seen," Captain Rousseau replied carefully. "He's facing multiple investigations now. The Board of Governors review, the International Confederation's inquiry, and potentially criminal charges if evidence of deliberate child endangerment is substantiated." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Dr. Beaumont entered, followed by an unexpected visitor, Hermione Granger, looking determined despite her obviously emotional state. "Hermione?" Harry stood, surprised by her early morning appearance. "Harry, I needed to see you before you left," she said, crossing the room to embrace him briefly. "I wanted to give you this." She handed him a thick scroll, tied with green ribbon. "It's a petition. Every student who witnessed your mistreatment, who saw you face dangers that should have been handled by adults, who recognized that you deserved better. We all signed it." Harry unrolled the parchment, his eyes widening as he saw the signatures. Not just Gryffindors, but Hufflepuffs still mourning Cedric's death, Ravenclaws who had observed the tournament's irregularities, and even Slytherins who had recognized the systematic nature of his endangerment. "Draco Malfoy organized the Slytherin signatures," Hermione added with a slight smile. "He said, and I quote, 'Whatever else Potter is, he doesn't deserve to be systematically abused by the adults who claim to protect him.'" The petition was more than just a list of names. Many students had added personal notes, memories of times they'd seen Harry struggle alone, instances where they'd wanted to help but hadn't known how, expressions of support for his decision to seek protection elsewhere. "There are over 300 signatures," Hermione continued. "Nearly every student in the castle who's old enough to understand what happened." Harry stared at the parchment, overwhelmed by this demonstration of support from peers who had witnessed his struggles and chosen to stand with him publicly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "All of you. Oh, this means more than you know." After Hermione left, Dr. Beaumont settled into her usual position for their therapeutic sessions. "How are you processing all of this, Harry?" she asked gently. "The media attention, the political consequences, the public support." Harry was quiet for a long moment, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to shift like quicksand. "It's overwhelming," he admitted finally. "I just wanted to be safe. I didn't expect it to become this. Change often starts with one person refusing to accept unacceptable circumstances," Dr. Beaumont observed. "Your decision to prioritize your own welfare has given others permission to examine their own situations, their own complicity in systems that harm children." "But people are getting hurt because of my choice," Harry protested. "Arthur Weasley is facing problems at work because his family supported me. McGonagall is dealing with political backlash. Students are being pressured to recant their petition signatures." "Harry," Dr. Beaumont said firmly, "you are not responsible for other people's reactions to your decision to seek protection. The people being hurt are being hurt by a system that prioritized maintaining power over protecting children. That system was already broken. Your choice simply made the cracks visible." Their session was interrupted by yet another arrival. Captain Rousseau returned, looking more grim than usual. "Mr. Potter, we have a complication. Someone is demanding to speak with you. Someone who claims to have legal standing regarding your guardianship." Harry's stomach dropped. "Dumbledore?" No, Sirius Black." The name hit the room like a physical force. Harry stared at Captain Rousseau in shock, his mind struggling to process this development. "Sirius is here? At Hogwarts?" "He contacted us directly," Captain Rousseau replied. "Through channels we cannot discuss openly. But he provided information that verifies his identity and his innocence of the crimes for which he was imprisoned." She paused, clearly struggling with the implications of what she was revealing. "He's demanding to speak with you about your guardianship. He claims that as your godfather, he has legal rights that supersede both Dumbledore's assumed authority and our offer of protection." Harry felt the world shift beneath him. Sirius here, alive and free, and claiming parental rights that could complicate everything he'd finally decided about his future. "What does he want?" Harry asked. "He wants to take you himself," Captain Rousseau replied. "He's arguing that James and Lily Potter specifically designated him as your guardian, and that his wrongful imprisonment doesn't negate that legal designation." The revelation created yet another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Just when Harry had finally made a choice about his future, his past was reasserting itself in ways he hadn't expected. "There's more," Captain Rousseau continued reluctantly. "Mr. Black provided us with information about documents that James and Lily Potter supposedly left with Gringotts Bank regarding your care. He claims these documents will prove that they never intended for you to be raised by the Dursleys or controlled by Dumbledore." "Documents?" Harry's voice was barely above a whisper. "What apparently your parents left very specific instructions about how they wanted you raised in the event of their deaths. Instructions that were never followed." Dr. Beaumont leaned forward, her professional instincts alert to Harry's increasing distress. "Harry, how do you feel about these new revelations?" "I don't know," Harry said honestly. "For 14 years I thought my parents just died. That they left no instructions, no preferences, no thoughts about what should happen to me. Now I'm learning that they did think about it, that they made plans, and that everyone ignored them anyway. The betrayal felt even deeper now. Not only had the adults in his life failed to protect him, but they had actively ignored his parents' wishes about his care. "I want to see these documents," Harry said suddenly, his voice carrying new determination. "I want to know what my parents actually wanted for me." "That can be arranged," Captain Rousseau replied. "But first, you need to decide whether you want to speak with Sirius Black. He's quite insistent about seeing you." Harry closed his eyes, trying to process yet another impossible choice. Sirius represented a connection to his parents, a link to the family he'd never known. But he also represented another adult claiming to know what was best for Harry's life. "Does he know about my decision to go with the Delacours?" Harry asked. "He does, and he's not pleased about it." Of course he wasn't. Another adult who thought he knew better than Harry himself what Harry needed. "I'll see him," Harry decided. "But I want you there, Dr. Beaumont, and Captain Rousseau. And I want it understood that I've already made my choice about where I'm going. This is a conversation, not a negotiation." As they prepared for what promised to be another emotionally fraught confrontation, Harry realized that his decision to seek protection in France had unleashed consequences far beyond his personal situation. He'd become the catalyst for a reckoning that would force the magical world to confront its failures in protecting its most vulnerable members. It was perhaps both more responsibility and more power than any 14-year-old should have to carry. But it was also, for the first time in his life, responsibility and power that he was choosing to wield rather than having thrust upon him. And that, Harry thought as he prepared to face yet another adult claiming to know what was best for his life, but made all the difference in the world. Chapter 11. Nouveau Commencement. New Beginning. The Delacour family home emerged from the French countryside like something from a fairy tale, its pale stone walls and climbing roses creating an atmosphere of warmth that Harry had never experienced before. As the portkey deposited them in the front garden on a perfect July morning, Harry found himself overwhelmed by the simple beauty of a place designed for living rather than defending. "Welcome home, Harry," Apolline said softly, her hand gentle on his shoulder as she guided him toward the front door. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it to be." The word home caught in Harry's throat. He'd lived in many places, Privet Drive, Hogwarts, or the Burrow occasionally, but none of them had ever been offered to him as home without conditions or expectations attached. The interior of the house reflected the same welcoming warmth as its exterior. Unlike the grandeur of Grimmauld Place or the institutional functionality of Hogwarts, every room seemed designed for comfort and connection. Family photographs lined the walls, not formal portraits that watched with judging eyes, but candid moments of laughter and love captured in magical motion. "Your room is upstairs," Fleur said, leading him up a staircase, worn smooth by generations of feet. "We thought you might like the one with the view of Z Garden." The room she showed him was larger than his bedroom at Privet Drive, but smaller than his dormitory at Hogwarts. What made it remarkable was how completely it belonged to him. No bars on the windows, no locks on the door, no sense that his presence was merely tolerated. Fresh flowers sat on the windowsill, and shelves waited empty for whatever books or belongings he might want to display. "It's perfect," Harry said, and meant it. That first week passed in a haze of adjustment that Harry found both wonderful and terrifying. The Delacours treated him with a casual affection that seemed to assume his worth rather than requiring him to prove it. Apolline would ruffle his hair when she passed his chair at breakfast. Monsieur Delacour would ask his opinion about the garden plantings, as if Harry's preferences mattered. Fleur included him in conversations about everything from magical theory to French wizarding politics, never speaking down to him, but never expecting more maturity than his years should carry. But it was Gabriel who proved to be the most transformative presence in his new life. Harry had never had a sibling, had never even imagined what that relationship might feel like. But Gabrielle, barely 11 and bubbling with excitement about starting Beauxbatons in the fall, seemed determined to adopt him as the big brother she'd never had. "Harry," she called one morning as he sat in the garden reading, "will you teach me the spell for making flowers dance? Fleur says you know all the best magic." "I don't know all the best magic," Harry protested, but he found himself smiling despite the correction. "But I can probably figure out flower dancing." Teaching Gabrielle magic became one of Harry's favorite activities. Not because she needed the instruction. She was already showing remarkable talent for someone who hadn't yet started formal schooling, but because her enthusiasm reminded him that magic could be joyful rather than merely functional for survival. "You make the flowers happy," Gabrielle observed as they practiced in the garden. "Most people, they make magic work because they have to. You make it work because you want to make beautiful things." The observation caught Harry off guard. He'd never thought of his magic as creating beauty, only as a tool for protecting himself and others. But watching the flowers dance in the afternoon sunlight, their petals swirling in patterns he'd unconsciously woven from memory and instinct, he began to understand what she meant. "Dr. Beaumont would like that observation," he said, thinking of his twice-weekly sessions with the French ministry's trauma specialist. "She keeps telling me that healing means discovering parts of myself that existed before the trauma." "What was you like before the trauma?" Gabrielle asked, with the directness that only children possessed. Harry was quiet for a long moment, realizing he didn't have an answer. He'd been barely more than a baby when the trauma began. He had no memories of himself before the cupboard under the stairs, before the constant fear, before the assumption that his existence was a burden to be endured rather than a gift to be celebrated. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I think maybe I'm discovering that now." The discovery process was slower and more complex than Harry had expected. Or simple things that other teenagers took for granted, like choosing what to eat for breakfast or deciding how to spend a free afternoon, required careful consideration from someone who'd never been allowed preferences before. "You can have the eggs however you like them," Apolline said patiently one morning when Harry stared at the breakfast offerings with obvious confusion. "Scrambled, fried, poached, or something else entirely. What sounds good to you?" "I don't know what I like," Harry confessed, feeling foolish. "The Dursleys never, and at Hogwarts everyone just ate whatever was served." "Then we experiment?" Apolline replied, matter-of-factly. "Today scrambled, tomorrow fried, the next day poached. Eventually you will discover your preference." Such moments of patient exploration became a regular part of Harry's days. What Monsieur Delacour taught him practical skills he'd never learned, how to do his own laundry properly, how to organize his belongings, how to budget allowance money for personal purchases. Not because Harry lacked intelligence or capability, but because he'd never been allowed the normal teenage experience of gradual independence. At Hogwarts, Harry explained during one of these lessons, everything was either provided for us or we went without. At the Dursleys, I did chores but never learned to manage my own affairs. "Then you learn now," Monsieur Delacour said simply. "Independence is a skill like any other. It must be practiced." The magic tutoring provided by the French ministry revealed gaps in Harry's education that were both embarrassing and enlightening. Or he could produce a Patronus and had survived encounters with some of the darkest creatures imaginable, but he struggled with basic household charms and had never learned defensive magic that wasn't born from desperate necessity. "Your magical education has been incomplete," his tutor, Maître Laurent, observed diplomatically during their first session. "Very advanced in some areas, but missing fundamental knowledge that most students acquire gradually." "I learned what I needed to survive," Harry replied, a defensive note creeping into his voice. "Survival magic and practical magic are different things," Laurent explained gently. "Survival magic is powerful but narrow, designed for specific threats. A practical magic is broader but gentler, designed for living well rather than merely living. Learning practical magic felt almost like learning to be human rather than merely a weapon. Charms for organizing belongings, spells for maintaining personal hygiene, magical techniques for creating comfort and beauty rather than protection and destruction. Small magics that had nothing to do with fighting dark wizards and everything to do with the simple pleasure of existence. Letters from his Hogwarts friends arrived regularly, maintaining connections that Harry treasured even as he worked to establish his new identity. Hermione's letters were full of research about trauma recovery and magical education theory, while Ron's contained Quidditch news and family updates. The twins wrote jointly, their letters full of jokes and gentle encouragement that never pressured him to return before he was ready. But it was the letter that arrived in mid-July that caught Harry most off guard. "Bill Weasley is coming to visit," Fleur announced over breakfast, looking pleased. "He has some vacation time and wants to see how you are settling." Harry felt a complex mix of excitement and anxiety at the prospect. Bill represented his connection to the wizarding world he'd left behind, but also the first test of whether his healing progress was real or merely the result of isolation from his former life. Bill arrived on a sunny Thursday afternoon, his long hair tied back and his dragon-hide jacket exchanged for casual French robes. He looked older than Harry remembered, more settled into adult life, but his smile held the same warmth that had made him one of Harry's favorite Weasley brothers. "You look good, Harry," Bill said, after they'd settled in the garden with cold drinks provided by Apolline. "Really good. Different." "Different how?" Harry asked, curious about the observation. "Relaxed," Bill replied without hesitation. "I don't think I've ever seen you without that constant tension, like you were always waiting for the next attack." Harry considered this, realizing Bill was right. The hypervigilance that had been his constant companion for as long as he could remember had gradually faded over the weeks in France. He no longer checked exits when he entered a room or startled at unexpected sounds. "It's been peaceful here," Harry admitted. "Really peaceful. But sometimes I feel guilty about it." "Guilty?" Bill's expression sharpened with concern. "Why?" "Because there are still problems back home. Voldemort is still out there. People are still in danger. And here I am, learning to make flower arrangements and choosing my favorite breakfast foods." Harry's voice carried self-recrimination that months of therapy hadn't entirely erased. Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying Harry with the kind of attention that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Harry," he said finally, "do you remember what you were like at the end of 4th year? Before all this happened?" Harry nodded uncertainly. "You were exhausted, traumatized, running on nothing but adrenaline and obligation. If you'd stayed in that state and tried to face Voldemort, what do you think would have happened?" "I would have fought," Harry replied automatically. "You would have died," Bill corrected gently but firmly. "Not heroically, not meaningfully but uselessly. Because weapons that are damaged beyond repair don't work when you need them most." The analogy stung, but Harry recognized its accuracy. "The healing you're doing here isn't selfish," Bill continued. "It's strategic. You're not running away from the fight. You're preparing for it properly for the first time in your life. And if people get hurt while I'm preparing, people were already getting hurt while you were being systematically damaged," Bill pointed out. "Your suffering didn't protect anyone, Harry. It just made you less capable of effective protection when it mattered." That evening, as they sat around the family dinner table, sharing one of Apolline's elaborate meals, Harry found himself observing the easy dynamics of a functional family. Gentle teasing between siblings, comfortable silences, the assumption that everyone's contributions to the conversation were valued. It was everything the Dursleys hadn't been, and everything Hogwarts, for all its magic, couldn't provide. "I've been thinking," Harry said during a lull in the conversation, "about what Bill said today, about preparing instead of just surviving." "What are your thoughts?" Monsieur Delacour asked, giving Harry his full attention. I think maybe I need to stay longer than I originally planned, Harry admitted. Not just to heal from what happened, but to actually learn how to live well, or how to be someone who can help others from a place of strength rather than just mutual damage. Fleur smiled warmly. We would be happy to have you stay as long as you need. Even if it means missing part of my Hogwarts education? Your Hogwarts education was teaching you to be a martyr, Apolline said, with uncharacteristic bluntness. What you are learning here is how to be a complete person. Which do you think will serve the world better? Later that night, as Harry sat by his window, looking out at the peaceful French countryside, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. The constant anxiety that had shaped his existence for 14 years was gradually being replaced by something he was only beginning to recognize as contentment. For the first time in his life, he was discovering who Harry Potter might be when he wasn't constantly in crisis. And while that person was still taking shape, Harry found himself looking forward to the discovery, rather than dreading what he might find. It was, he realized, the first time he'd ever looked forward to his own future. And that alone made every difficult choice that had brought him here worth it. Tomorrow would bring more healing, more learning, more gentle exploration of a life lived for joy rather than mere survival. And for the first time since his parents died, Harry Potter went to sleep believing that tomorrow might actually be better than today. The revolution had become evolution, and it was beautiful. Chapter 12. L'avenir, the future. October in the French countryside painted the world in shades of gold and crimson, and Harry Potter stood at his bedroom window, watching the morning light dance across gardens that had become as familiar as breathing. 3 months had passed since he'd arrived at the Delacour family home as a traumatized refugee from his own life. The boy who gazed out at the autumn landscape bore little resemblance to the hollow-eyed child who had first crossed this threshold. The physical changes were obvious. He'd gained weight, grown taller, developed the healthy color that came from regular meals and genuine rest. But the deeper transformations were more remarkable. The constant tension that had defined his existence for 14 years had been replaced by something Harry was still learning to recognize as peace. "Harry!" Gabrielle's voice called from downstairs, bright with excitement. "The letter from Hogwarts has arrived." Harry smiled, unhurried for perhaps the first time in his life when summoned by adults or their concerns. The letter would wait. His response would be considered, not reactive. These were luxuries he'd earned through months of patient healing. He found the family gathered around the breakfast table, the official Hogwarts envelope sitting unopened beside his usual place setting. Professor McGonagall's precise handwriting addressed him as Mr. Harry Potter, and for once, the sight of his name on formal correspondence didn't fill him with dread. "You do not have to open it now if you are not ready," Apolline said gently, her maternal instincts still finely tuned to his emotional state despite the progress he'd made. "I'm ready," Harry replied, and realized he meant it. Nor the letter contained exactly what he'd expected, an invitation to return to Hogwarts for his 5th year, along with a detailed accounting of the changes that had been implemented in his absence. "What does she say?" Fleur asked, settling into the chair beside him with her own correspondence. "New student welfare protocols," Harry read aloud, his voice carrying notes of satisfaction and vindication. "Mandatory reporting requirements for faculty who observe signs of abuse or neglect. An independent student advocate position, someone whose only job is protecting student welfare rather than institutional interests. Regular mental health assessments for all students who've experienced trauma." He looked up from the letter, meeting the warm gazes of the family that had become his anchor. "She's asking if I want to return, or with conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Monsieur Delacour asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Regular contact with you, my chosen family. The right to leave immediately if my welfare is threatened. Access to continued therapeutic support. Most importantly." Harry paused, savoring the significance of what he was about to say. the right to refuse participation in any activity or situation that I believe puts my safety at unnecessary risk." The implications were revolutionary. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, would no longer be obligated to face danger simply because adults decided it was necessary for some greater good. "And what do you want to do?" Dr. Beaumont asked from the doorway, where she'd arrived for their regularly scheduled session. Harry had been expecting this question for weeks, or had been turning it over in his mind during their therapy sessions and quiet family dinners. The answer, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. "I want to go back," he said, "but not as the person I was before. I want to go back as someone who understands that my life has value beyond my usefulness to other people's causes." Dr. Beaumont smiled with professional satisfaction. "That sounds like the response of someone who has done significant healing work." "I have you all to thank for that," Harry replied, encompassing the room with a gesture that included both his therapeutic support and his chosen family. Later that morning, as he walked through the village with Fleur to post his reply to McGonagall, Harry reflected on how profoundly his world had changed. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Fleur asked as they approached the post office. "Returning to the place where you suffered so much?" "I'm certain that running away isn't the same as healing," Harry replied, words that would have been impossible for him to articulate just months ago. "I can't let fear of what was prevent me from engaging with what could be. And if they try to manipulate you again? If they pressure you to sacrifice yourself for their greater good?" Harry's smile carried a confidence that was entirely new. "Then they'll discover that the boy who lived has learned to say no." Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected sight: a young girl with long blonde hair and large, protuberant eyes standing beside the post office, apparently waiting for someone. "Luna Lovegood," Harry called, recognizing her from the Quidditch World Cup despite their brief interaction. "Hello, Harry Potter," Luna replied in her characteristic dreamy voice, though her eyes held a sharpness that suggested more awareness than her tone implied. "I was hoping I might run into you." "What are you doing in France?" Harry asked, curious about this unexpected encounter. "Visiting my great-aunt Ophelia. She lives just over the hill." Luna gestured vaguely toward the surrounding countryside. "But mostly I wanted to meet the person who taught the magical world that children are allowed to expect better treatment." The simple statement hit Harry with unexpected force. He'd been so focused on his own healing that he hadn't fully considered the broader implications of his choice. "What do you mean?" he asked. Luna's smile was radiant. "At Hogwarts, I just started this year. The older students tell stories about Harry Potter who said no, about how one person, refusing to accept mistreatment, gave everyone else permission to expect kindness instead of cruelty." She pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with neat handwriting. "I've been documenting the changes. 3 students reported family abuse to the new student advocate in the first month of term. 2 more asked for help with learning difficulties that had been ignored by previous administrations. The house elves have been given better working conditions because someone pointed out that if Harry Potter deserved protection from systematic mistreatment, perhaps they did too." Harry stared at her, overwhelmed by the ripple effects of what he'd thought was simply a personal decision to seek safety. "I didn't mean to start a revolution," he said quietly. "The best revolutions are started by people who just want to be treated decently," Luna replied matter-of-factly. "You showed everyone that it's possible to choose protection over martyrdom. That's a very valuable gift." As they walked back to the Delacour home, Harry found himself thinking about Luna's words. He'd spent so much energy processing his own healing that he hadn't fully grasped how his choice had created space for other vulnerable people to seek better treatment. "She is right, you know," Fleur said, as if reading his thoughts. "What you did, choosing yourself, demanding better, it changed the conversation about how children should be treated in our world." "Is that why you've decided to study international magical law?" Harry asked, remembering conversations they'd had about her career plans. Fleur nodded. I want to create legal frameworks that make it harder for adults to sacrifice children for their political goals. What happened to you should never happen to anyone else. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Harry found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a traumatized child accepting abuse as normal, because powerful adults told him it was necessary. Now he was surrounded by people who valued his opinion, supported his choices, and expected nothing from him beyond his willingness to engage authentically with life. I've been thinking about writing, he announced as Apolline served the soup course. Not about the war or Voldemort or any of that. Just letters to my younger self. About what I've learned. What I wish someone had told me when I was 11 and scared and alone. That sounds like a wonderful therapeutic exercise, Dr. Beaumont encouraged. What would you tell your younger self? Harry was quiet for a moment, organizing thoughts that felt both deeply personal and surprisingly universal. That suffering isn't noble, that protection isn't weakness, that asking for help doesn't make you a burden. He paused, then added with a slight smile, and that some French families make the most amazing hot chocolate in the world. The laughter around the table was warm and inclusive, the kind that builds connection rather than highlighting differences. Later that night, Harry sat at the desk in his room and began writing. Dear Harriet 11, what you're about to enter a world that will try to convince you that your pain serves a greater purpose. Don't believe them. Your pain serves no one, not even yourself. You will face adults who claim to love you while systematically failing to protect you. You will be told that your suffering builds character, that hardship creates heroes, that sacrifice is noble. These are lies told by people who find it easier to use you than to actually care for you. The truth is simpler and harder. You deserve protection simply because you exist. You deserve kindness, not because you've earned it, but because all children deserve kindness. You deserve to have adults who prioritize your welfare over their political goals, your happiness over their definition of duty. It will take you years to learn that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That healing isn't running away, it's preparation for engaging with life from a position of strength rather than desperation. But you will learn these things eventually. And when you do, you'll discover that the world is full of people who will value you for who you are rather than what you can do for them. That future is waiting for you. All you have to do is survive long enough to claim it. With love and hope for better days, Harry at 15. As he sealed the letter, not to send anywhere, but simply to mark the completion of a thought, Harry realized that for the first time in his life, he was genuinely excited about his future. Not because he knew what it would hold, but because he finally trusted himself to make good choices about whatever came next. Whether that was returning to Hogwarts, facing Voldemort eventually, or simply learning to live as a normal young man who happened to have extraordinary experiences, he would approach it as someone who understood his own worth. The morning light was beginning to fade into evening when an owl arrived with another letter, this one from Hermione, full of updates about the transformed atmosphere at Hogwarts under McGonagall's leadership. It's completely different, Harry, she wrote. Students actually feel safe reporting problems to adults. The new welfare protocols mean that teachers have to take concerns seriously rather than dismissing them. And the older students, especially the ones who witnessed what you went through, have become incredibly protective of the younger ones. But it's like your choice taught everyone that protection isn't something we have to earn. It's something we all deserve. Harry smiled as he read her account of a Hogwarts where student welfare was actually prioritized over institutional convenience. It sounded like a place where he might actually be able to learn rather than merely survive. His final therapy session before returning to England took place in the garden, surrounded by the flowers that had become his first successful attempt at magic for joy rather than survival. "How do you feel about leaving?" Dr. Beaumont asked, though her question carried curiosity rather than concern. Nervous, Harry admitted. But good nervous. Excited nervous. Like I'm finally ready to engage with my life instead of just enduring it. And if people try to pressure you into old patterns? If they expect you to resume your role as the martyred hero? Harry's smile carried hard-won wisdom. Then they'll discover that the person who learned to choose himself isn't going to stop doing it just because it makes other people uncomfortable. As September faded into October and his departure date approached, Harry found himself looking forward to the future with something he was only beginning to recognize as genuine hope. Not the desperate hope of someone who had no other options, but the confident hope of someone who finally understood his own value and trusted himself to protect it. The boy who lived was becoming the boy who chose to live well. And that, Harry thought as he watched the sunset paint the French countryside in shades of gold and promise, was the most powerful magic of all. 3 days later, but as the portkey activated to carry him back to Scotland, Harry Potter smiled. He was returning not as a sacrifice or a symbol, but as a young man who had learned that his greatest act of heroism might simply be insisting on his right to be happy. The future stretched before him, uncertain but no longer terrifying, because for the first time in his life it belonged entirely to him.